and welcome. Good morning. This is the meeting of the NHS Lancashire and South Cumbria Integrated Care Board. It's the 12th of October. We have no apologies for absence today, but there's a number of colleagues I would like to welcome to the meeting. Firstly, as a partner member of the board, Chris Oliver. Welcome, Chris. Has taken over from Caroline Donovan. Good to see you here, Chris. And we've new participant member John Redmond, who's the Director of Adult and Social Care at Cumbria County Council. Welcome, John. And also here today, although still in designate not started, Craig Harris, who sat there on the front row, is joining the ICB executive team as the Chief of Health and Care Integration and starting next month. But looking forward to working with you, Craig. Welcome to the meeting today. We've no new declarations of interest. You can see the list there to note. If any member of the board feels conflicted at any point in any of the discussions, you just raise that at the time. Thank you. We've got the minutes of our last meeting on the 7th of September. I know that we've had one or two slight accuracy points raised outside of the meeting, which we've got to address. Any questions, points on the minutes? I've got your point, Angie. Thank you. Any others? Can I propose that we adopt the minutes formally, please? Thank you, Roy. In terms of outstanding issues, looking at the action log, the one that's there, David, is around the we discussed 2 meetings ago about the change in stroke services in the North Mersey, West Lancashire area. There was a bit of follow-up. Is all that on track to our satisfaction? So
yes, it is. We actually had our meeting before Cheshire and Mersey, and they met some weeks after us. So there's only recently any change to the service, which is a slight change. And as we agreed, there will be monitoring if there's any change in the flow of patients as a result of that. Thank you. And Kevin, where's Kevin? On this, how does this look from Lanc's teaching end?
I think there's still concern operationally that it could increase the numbers through the hyperacute unit on the Preston site. So as David said, we just need to monitor the numbers very carefully. And if there is an increase, then we'll have to have the conversations as a system about how we deal with it. So except that the changes are going ahead in Merseyside, it's right that they do go ahead, but we just need to be very careful and monitor very carefully the impact on our services.
Thank you. Okay. We look forward to receiving an update on that as we go forward.
If I may, there was one action from the minutes which wasn't included in the action log, which was around primary care. It was the primary care deep dive, and there was a suggestion we would bring something back to the board. It's just to update the board that we anticipate bringing back our response to Fuller and all the work that's been done working with multidisciplinary teams to inform that Lancashire and South Cumbria response to Fuller. That will come back in December.
December?
December.
Okay, thank you. Right, so for the first time in our meetings today, we now have a patient story item. As we've said in here before, it's always a challenge for an organisation like ours, which doesn't directly provide care, to remain very rooted in the issues that our patients, carers, families, communities face on a day-to-day basis. And I think that the way in which, there's a number of ways in which we do that through the public and patient involvement and so on, but I do think the idea that we can focus on a patient case study each meeting is one of the important ways we do that, Sarah. So over to you, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm only going to say a couple of words before we watch the video, and then I'll make a few comments after it. So first of all, I'd like to start by thanking our comms team and our engagement team for getting the video together for us, and they are working now on a programme of patient stories that we can bring to board. So a big thank you to them. The video today explores the experiences of Anuska, who is a patient, but she's also a care worker working in Lancashire and South Cumbria. And she talks about her experience of contracting COVID and then the impact that long COVID had on her, and also her experience of using the virtual ward. I think we've got a lot of papers on the agenda today around the challenges going into winter. And we know that the COVID rates are rising again. So I think it's a timely reminder to us, not only of the challenge of COVID, but also the impact that a physical illness can have on someone's life and also on their mental well-being. So if we could play the video now, please.
Hi, my name's Anushka. I'm a development officer for a care and support organisation called 360 Degrees Healthcare. I contracted COVID at the end of November and I'm still feeling the effects of having COVID. When I got COVID back in November, I thought, it's just a bit of flu, I don't feel very well. I didn't actually realise that I had COVID because my first symptom was a headache and a migraine. And then I started losing my taste. And on that evening, I then was awake all night, struggling to breathe. I lost my taste and my smell, and to this day, I still can't taste and smell certain things. I've been told by my doctors that I might never get my smell back, 100%. With being asthmatic anyway, since having COVID, whenever I kind of will do something, so I'll go shopping to the local Asda or to Morrison's, the next day I will be absolutely shattered and really struggle to wake up and get out of bed in the morning. Constantly, daily, feel overexhausted and tired. Simple tasks, like I said, going to the shop or going to see my friend is really exhausting. But this summer, because of the heat, I was really struggling to breathe and couldn't do things that I usually would do. When I was diagnosed with COVID, I got sent to a COVID online ward, so I would have a nurse ringing me daily just to check my blood pressure and to see how I was. I'm particularly worried and scared with the winter flu period because my chest, you might not be able to see it in this video, but my chest constantly hurts and I'm constantly in pain with my chest. I've had x-rays, which is saying that it's just COVID and they don't really know what to do with me. But yeah, that's my experience of long COVID, and it really worries me. It's had a huge effect on my mental health. I'll go once a week, twice a week, I'll cry just because I feel drained and absolutely shattered. Work have been really helpful and really supportive and said that I can have shorter days or reduce my hours in work if required. But then obviously that will have a long-term effect on my salary and my wage. So it's all these things that are come into play. When I got COVID back in November, I actually attended the virtual ward in December of last year. I got sent a blood pressure monitor by them so I could check my blood pressure every day. In terms of kind of COVID support, I found them really helpful. So they were ensuring when I was speaking to them, they were seeing if I was okay. They were advising me to ring 999 if I ever felt worse. I think post that, I've not really had much support, and that's what I'm struggling with now. When I'm ringing my doctors and things like that, they're not 100% sure what to do with me. So I am hoping, because there's a lot of kind of COVID wards still out there that's up for long COVID, so I'm hoping that I can get introduced to that at some point.
Thank you, Chair. So just a couple of comments from me. I think it was very clear from her story of the impact that COVID has had on her, and I think it's really pertinent for us to remember that, particularly as we're moving towards deeper integration and wider working with our wider community sector, because some of the support, you know, she was talking about how difficult it could be now to access the GP and what support to offer. It's possible that some of the support she needs might be in that wider community sector and voluntary sector, and I think that's an important thing for us to take away. The other plea actually on the back of that story is we are heading into winter, COVID rates are rising, we're worried about flu. So I think it's a timely reminder to everybody here, but anybody watching, and to our public, to get their flu and COVID vaccinations. I had mine at the weekend just gone, so I feel like I've protected myself going into winter. So I think it's really, really important, you know, these threats haven't gone away. So it's really important that we remind our communities of that, and that we all set an example as senior leaders in the system and get our vaccinations. And it is remembering that long COVID and a lot of other long-term conditions do have significant long-lasting effects on people's lives. So I think we just need to think about that when we're planning our services and designing our services, and working with our voluntary sector and our communities about how do we put different types of support around people. I also thought the point she made about the concern her income, in some ways she's fortunate because she's a care worker. She's clearly got a compassionate employer there who is making adjustments for her, but many of our community won't be working in a sector that will make adjustments. But even where they make adjustments, her concern about her income, and we know the challenging economic climate that we're working in at the moment, and the deep impact that's going to have on some of our most challenged communities, and for people living with any sort of illness or challenge, that's going to be a real concern for them. And the last thing I wanted to say really was, I think it was a really good illustration of how the virtual wards and different ways of approaching support can really help. And I think we need to encourage our public to use those things, and to see that actually a phone call or a digital appointment can be just as effective as going into a face-to-face appointment. And I know David and the team are doing some really important work on moving and rolling out the virtual ward further, particularly as we go into winter. And then the last thing for me was really just to thank Anoska for the video and for sharing her experience with us today. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Sarah. David, two of the things that came through Anushka's story and that Sarah's referenced, one about our understanding of the prevalence of long COVID across the communities as a whole, and how that looks from a science point of view, and secondly the issue about virtual wards and how the use of and development of virtual wards is working across the whole of Lancashire and South Cumbria, and if it's all going at the same pace everywhere.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to declare a conflict of interest here, in that my wife has long COVID. Okay? And I think what we heard, in fact, from that patient's story was something that was very real. And my wife had COVID back in March of 2020. It still impacts on her now. So long COVID, the problem is it's actually, and it's very interesting because in fact today the WHO, I think, has come out saying long COVID is a real issue, and it is a health problem for the whole world. It's a number of different conditions. It's kind of all bundled together as long COVID. It typically tends to affect, it's more women than men. It tends to affect women in their 30s and 40s, as we saw from that video there. And it has a profound impact upon them. And you don't have to have a really bad dose of COVID and actually be hospitalised, be in intensive care, to be someone who actually goes on to suffer from long COVID. And that brain fog, that tiredness that we heard from the patient video is something that is very, very real. And it has a real impact on the ability for people to work, for their daily activities, for example. So within Lancs and South Cumbria, we have a long COVID service that was set up. It was set up probably around about 18 months ago. And it may be that Chris will want to come in at some point because, in fact, Lancs and South Cumbria FT are the lead commissioner for that service. And through that commissioning of that service, what we have done is rolled out the provision of long COVID clinics, which is run typically by our hospitals because long COVID is often a diagnosis that is made by exclusion. You have to say, well, you have to check there aren't any other serious illnesses. There are blood tests which have to be done as well. So what we've done in Lancs and South Cumbria, we've ensured there's a long COVID service for our patients. And that service is there to pick up not just the physical issues and helping people understand how they can get breathing exercises to help with their breathing, but also help them with some of the mental health issues they have as well, which is also associated with the condition. The virtual wards, we've actually done a lot of work, again, with the providers of the community services over the last 12 weeks, because virtual wards is a fantastic new way of working. It really is brilliant. You know, the fact is, if you're a patient, do I have to go to hospital? Do I have to go to A&E? And the fact is, here's an opportunity that if you are in hospital, you can get home sooner. If you go to the A&E department, and for example, at Kevin's Hospital, you go there and you've got a respiratory condition, the option is now there for the A&E doctors to say, well, the good news is if we'll refer you to the virtual wards, you can go to the virtual wards, you don't have to come into our hospital. We will look after you and you can be at home. And it's a fantastic model. It's really great. And we've agreed trajectories. We hope to get to about 750 beds by December of next year, but already we're at over 100 beds. And it's something that the clinicians are really engaged with. We did it for respiratory conditions, we're doing it for frailty, we're now doing it for end-of-life care, we're about to do it for paediatrics. The cardiac doctors want a bit of it as well. It's a brilliant new model. You're caring for the patients at home. They don't necessarily have to be in hospital, but we can also get patients out sooner. Thank you.
Thank you. Maggie.
Thank you. I think the challenges for our staff is really drawn out as well in what we heard in that lady's story. On page 8 of the performance report, we've just pulled out that sickness across Lancs and South Cumbria has been increasing all year, and whilst the reasons for that aggregated high level of sickness is mental health and musculoskeletal in the main, we aren't able to quantify what the latent effects of long COVID is on our workforce. I know there will be members of our staff who are listening to this today who are impacted in the way that we've heard in the story, and I don't know. I'm managing everyone's expectations as well as my own. I'm day 22. I can't sit here and give you lots of facts and figures around this subject. I don't know what we are doing collectively to try and reach out to our staff who are affected in this way. But I do know just anecdotally from talking to my team and people who I've met during the induction period that the financial impacts of having long COVID are being felt very acutely across the breadth of our patch. And I think that will impact as we go into winter. I also don't know, and I'm embarrassed to say, about where we're seeing aggregated figures around the vaccination programme. And is that something that we need to build into the performance report when we get onto that subject in a few minutes? But I do think we've got to do more for our staff in the preparation for winter.
Chris.
Thank you, Chair. And so I think it follows on a bit from what Maggie said around the Resilience Hub. So Lancs and South Cumbria Foundation Trust hosts the Resilience Hub, and I think it's pertinent to make sure that as senior leaders we promote that within our organisations, and that as a provider we provide timely care for people that require support for their mental health. We know going into this winter is going to be a significant challenge. I think just coming back to David's point around the long COVID service, so clearly there has been an increase in demand for the long COVID service, and whilst we will streamline and signpost people to both physical health and mental health, it's that integration of both, and when patients are referred into secondary care that we still maintain that link in with them to support them through their mental health, and that's that common thread, isn't it, I suppose, of mental health and physical health integration.
Thank you, Chris, and it's an important theme for us here, clearly, literally around integrated care boards to look at the way in which different parts of the service effectively come together. I've got Abdul and Kevin, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Really, just on Maggie's point, really, in relation to the COVID vaccination data, there is a Lancashire South Cumbria COVID Vaccination Oversight Board, which has actually been in place since December 2020. Jane Scattergood, who's actually with us this morning, actually chairs that with Paul Havey and colleagues. I've been a member of that, and the just for Maggie's assurance and the board's assurance, the data is actually presented there, and we have health inequalities work streams attached to it as well. Thank you.
I saw some numbers that came out of I think it was the National NHS England board meeting last week, which, and I don't know how these play into our system, Abdul, but basically, if I interpreted it correctly, said that if white British equal 100 as a benchmark in terms of continuing to get work through the booster programme and so on, then Pakistani, Bangladeshi were 63 compared to the 100, and Afro-Caribbean were 40-something%. So the huge difference in uptake in different parts of the community. I think it might be helpful, Kevin, if we come back at a future meeting with a deeper look into some of those. I don't know if those numbers, Abdul, read across into, or Jane, into our communities, but it's blowing almost the difference
The-
between
the-
different communities.
Yeah, for the initial phases, really, there clearly was slightly lower uptake within certain communities, and that was actually well documented, Chair, in relation to our diverse communities, not only from ethnicity perspective, but our GRT and transient communities as well. We do have a range of services, including a home service, in terms of actually vaccinating whole families, in terms of that nurse provision. And we've used innovation, and we've been cited as a national exemplar in terms of the innovative approach that we've actually taken alongside other areas in the country. There is obviously a lot of work in relation to the spring booster. There was clearly a slight dip, really, in terms of those communities that you refer to, and clearly we're doing everything that we can through our community organisations, our community champions, and work really with faith organisations in terms of getting the message across and making the offer accessible to local communities as easily as possible. For in Blackwell and Darwen, for example, we're actually providing free public transport to actually get to the actual vaccination site. Thank you.
Thank you. And think about, Kevin, if we can look into this more and keep on top of it as the winter goes through. Kevin, please.
Thanks, David. In terms of the patient's story, that sort of complex mix that we saw in terms of both physical, mental and social needs is what we're really seeing increasing on a day-by-day basis in terms of patients within our system. And it is, in terms of the acuity of the patients that we're seeing in the system now, that is increasing. So we do need to think, and we are thinking about what the impact that will be longer term in terms of our services. But I just wanted to sort of back up David in terms of his comments about virtual wards. What's really clear is from a Lancs and South Cumbria perspective, we are one of the better performers, not just regionally, but nationally, in terms of both the rollout of the virtual ward, but also the uptake of the actual virtual beds that we have, which is one of the highest percentage in the country. And that's really commendable to the leadership and the local buy-in to virtual wards. And I think it's really important that we all get behind these virtual wards as a system, because what we've focused on in Lancs and South Cumbria is to use the virtual wards as a form of avoidance admittance. And the more we can do that, and the more we can get behind it and support the virtual wards, both from a community, primary care, secondary care, social care perspective, I think it would really help us not just this winter but longer term. So really to support David and his support for virtual wards.
Thank you. I'm glad you said that. I was going to make the comment that 100 sounded pretty weedy actually across our patch, but clearly, you know, in terms of relative understanding, that's pretty good. I've got Jim, then Jeff, please.
Thank you, and thanks for the patient story, which was really good. But there did seem to be a slight disconnect. I was really encouraged what David said and what Chris added about the long COVID service. Anuska said, though, she was virtual ward sort of finished for her, and then she was just left in nowhere, basically, in limbo. So there almost seems to be a disconnect between us saying we've got this really good service developed and the patient who's not been picked up by that service and signposted to wherever she should be going. So it feels like we need to somehow bring those two things together.
Thank you. Good point. Jeff, then back to David.
Thanks, Chair. I think you really feel the pain of somebody who has got an illness that you can't diagnose easily. Once it's diagnosed, you can't treat it easily, and you've got no way of knowing when it finishes. So that's what I get from the story and the economic injury. The point I want to make, though, is a commissioning one, really, and that is, I don't think we know everyone who's got long COVID. I think the numbers are around 10%, but it depends which study you look at, which research and anything else, but it's quite big, and we see lots of it. But we're seeing patients with illnesses which we don't know whether it's connected with COVID because there's no test. So what I'm trying to say is there's a volume of patients out there with a variety of physical and mental health problems, as has been said, as well as the social problems, that's not determined accurately, but is adding to the workload. And we don't know when it's going to end, and we've got a pandemic that's going on. So I think we just have to be prepared that this will make a major dent into our resources over not just the coming year, but years. And that will, of course, stretch primary care and hospital services and social care services. So it's bigger than a lot of people imagine or want to make out.
Right. David, then James, then David.
Okay, so I just wanted to come back with to Jim's point. The virtual ward is set up in many respects to ensure that patients can cope at home with with the support from a nurse, for example. But that's a kind of almost a kind of subacute sort of episode. And typically, once the nurse thinks things are settling down, that's fine. Long COVID is a different condition from COVID, and typically, and Jeff has kindly highlighted that, it's very difficult to diagnose. The other thing you don't get long COVID until you've probably 8-12 weeks out from the COVID episode that you had. So, and typically, what happens is, I mean, it has been quite difficult in the past because patients would have symptoms, they didn't know what to do, they would eventually go and see their GP. We've obviously now signposted the long COVID services to the GP, but we don't know who's going to get long COVID. That's the issue. So we could signpost everybody to the long COVID service, but the issue is it'd probably be overwhelmed. So it is, unfortunately, it's two separate episodes in some respects, and they're not connected because for the vast majority of patients who go into the virtual wards, even with COVID, they will not be ones who thankfully will pick up long COVID.
Thanks, Chair. I wanted just to pick up on Maggie's point around staff and that absolutely comes through strong in terms of the patient story. There's absolutely no doubt we have some comparable high areas of sickness absence across some of our provider organisations, but this is something that we're very much aware of, and it was something that we picked up in the people board, the first people board, as a priority piece of work. There is some really good work that's been going on within the providers in relation to well-being for staff, and some developments that are absolutely in train, including looking at scaling the well-being service, the occupational health service, some really good stuff that needs to be taken further and supported, and that's absolutely what we're going to do. So I'm working very closely with the HR directors. This is one of the 4 big priorities for this year that we signed off at the first people board 3 weeks ago, and we're going to be reporting back regularly on that. So just to give people some confidence and assurance, this is absolutely on the radar. It's on the radar for all of the providers. That we pulled out some granular work. We've had some really good data that we've developed with NHS England to really get under that number, so we now know where those really high areas are, and this is a weekly priority on the Friday HR directors group as well. So
that's good. Thanks, James. Ibby, and then to David.
Yeah, I thought was really interesting from Anushka's comments was that when she was now interacting with practitioners, she felt like they really didn't know what they were doing, and I think you summarised it really well. You know, this is something that we're all trying to learn about a bit more. It's going to take some time. Really important question then is, you know, in that interaction between patients and practitioners, what exactly should that look like, where we're still able to retain a degree of confidence, but also be able to level with where we are with our understanding of COVID. And the other question is, are we absolutely clear that all our GPs or the primary care staff are aware of the long COVID service and know that's where they need to be referring in from now on?
Well, the answer is, so the long COVID service typically, in fact, once you get referred, you'll be assessed by a multidisciplinary team, because long COVID is not just a respiratory condition. It can have an impact on your heart, it can have an impact on your bowel, it can have an impact on your mental health, and there's the tiredness as well. So in fact, it's a multidisciplinary team assessment, and often the patients will have access to a physiotherapist, an occupational therapist, and a psychologist. So that team working together. But what we've tried to do is ensure that all GPs are aware of the service. We're also aware of what tests they need to do before the patient's referred, and that's sometimes a bit of a stumbling block, but we want to make sure the right patients are referred. For example, you could be tired of losing weight but you've got cancer rather than you've got long COVID. So it's ensuring we refer the right patients to the long COVID service. So the GPs are requested to do some tests beforehand, but I think all our GPs are aware of that and their staff at the moment.
David?
Thank you. It's just on an earlier point about access to the COVID vaccination programme for different communities. So Jane Scattergood commissioned Healthwatch to carry out a piece of work over the last year to really look at what's stopping different communities from coming forward. So I wonder whether or not if the item comes back to a future board, we might be able to look specifically at that point. We've carried out, I think, 20 to 30 focus groups with different BAME communities to really understand and get under the skin, so to speak, of what's stopping people from coming forward for the vaccination. So that might be helpful.
Thank you. It's helpful on that. All right, thank you. I think this is a good way for us to start our meeting to get into some of the service issues. Sarah, well done. Thank you. Kevin, your report, please.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I think particularly with that patient story in mind, the leadership challenge we faced reminded me of probably the best opening line from any novel. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We're all going direct to heaven. We're all going direct the other way. That's Charles Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities, and it's one sentence. Absolutely brilliant, and it sums up our leadership dilemma perfectly. The downside is that the pressures we face in our system are truly immense. But the upside, which we shouldn't forget, is that any option can be considered in these extraordinary times. And our leadership task really is to convert that challenge into an amazing opportunity. I want to highlight 4 issues. There's a lot of stuff in the report. Happy to answer any questions, but I want to highlight 4 issues. If you'll tolerate me. Number 1, bank and agency. We've got a very high spend in this area. We're currently about 40% above, just over 40% above the NHS cap, and that's rising month on month. And it's not just about money. This is also about patient safety. The risks are pretty high with that level of agency staff. So it's pretty obvious we've got to do something in this area. It has been hard work to bring people with us. There is nervousness out there in trusts about quality, about using private sector partners, and losing control of agency decisions. Often have to be made quickly to fix urgent problems. I'm pleased, though, to say that we are now finally out to procurement, and I want to make sure that going forward with Kevin and his team, that we have a system-wide approach, a single approach, one evaluation, one quality assessment, one recommendation, one decision. We are working collaboratively. From our side, James Fleet is coordinating this exercise. He's done it before with a number of different partners, and he's working hand in glove with Kevin Moynes of the Provider Collaborative. We'll be asking this board to make decisions on behalf of the whole system going forward with back-to-back agreements with each trust. The latter agreements are likely to fall within CE delegations at trust level. But CEs may still want to report to their boards formally because this is a big issue. I've asked Sam Prophet to look at how the payment mechanisms might work with a partner, a private sector partner, in relation to our monthly payments to the trusts going forward. So, yeah, it's been a bit frustrating, but we are now moving forward. I think it does demonstrate the need for the Provider Collaborative to have a way of making collective decisions. That's not the case at the moment, either by some sort of committee in common, if you like, or a joint committee, or something similar. And I think it also demonstrates some of the cultural challenges we'll face as we transform how we do things going forward. You know, it's going to be tougher when you get to elective care or cancer diagnostics, for example, than something that's more of a back office activity. So that's first one, bank and agency. Second one is operating model for the ICB. You're all aware of the challenges we face, health outcomes, widening inequalities, challenging performance, a difficult fiscal outlook, and of course the pandemic, and we've heard about the long-term problems of long COVID there too. So a system under pressure, so we need to act swiftly to address these challenges. One of the things that's holding us back is confusion over who does what. It's natural, I think, given our recent history. We had a provider collaborative that was established before the ICB. We had a sort of pilot ICB, which was more focused on population health, and we've got a bigger range of statutory responsibilities. So we do need to be clear on what the operating model is for our system, what that means for the role of the ICB itself, what levers and processes are needed, what's the interface with the PCB, what's the role of the PCB itself, what arrangements do we need to put in place for our system to have a high-performing system that can act swiftly given the current challenges. So we're in the process of bringing in somebody with a lot of health experience at both provider and commissioning level to work with us to show us the light and eliminate the confusion. And you will all be contacted as part of that exercise. That person will want to talk to the members of this board, the chairs and the chief executives in our providers, the regional branch of the NHS and NHS, the relevant people centrally as well. There is some work underway now. KPMG, I think, have been engaged to work with NHSE to look at the operating model for the new NHSE, and that will include looking at the region and the ICB and how all of that links together. So we need to clearly dovetail into that. So that's, and my hope is that we can bring a report back for December. We can't hang around on this. We need to sort of reset things and move on. I think once we've got that out of the way, we'll probably need to do a similar exercise on place. We are now working with the place leaders to work out what the balance of responsibilities and that is between place and if you like, the ICB area, with a clear intention that we are going to be devolving going forward and building up place. I want to say a few words about finance. We've obviously got a detailed report further on the agenda, so I'm not going to go into the numbers, but I think we've just got to really underline Jeff Jalief's comments earlier. We've got to remember that the system is facing unprecedented challenges. We're still very much in a pandemic. We've got record patients in our hospitals with COVID again. We've got the emerging challenge of long COVID. We've got concerns about flu in winter. We've got a backlog in operations and a sharp growth in long-term conditions as well, and a sharp growth in individuals with multiple long-term conditions. So it's going to be particularly challenging in winter. Again, we've got another report on that, and we've got the cost of living crises. And these conditions, if you like, are going to be around for some time. This is not just a few months. This is years to come. So we've got a big challenge on our hands. You've already made some tough decisions on finance in July, but our position has worsened in the face of these challenges. We aren't delivering enough recurring savings, is the honest truth, and the current forecasts look rather better than the reality. If you unpick them, cash balances have been used in the early months, and quite a lot of the recurring savings are pushed towards the back of the financial year, so it's a bit of a hockey stick, if you like, and that's not great. So next year, if we don't deliver on the recurring savings, it's going to be really challenging. So we are looking, we're doing the 6-month forecast now, and I think it's timely that we do have a fundamental re-evaluation next month at the board of the risks around the year-end position. And probably it's time to ask ourselves some tough questions to what can we do to arrest a worsening position. It's obvious we need another get well plan, and we'll bring some recommendations to the November board. I think we've got to imagine we're a single organisation rather than a system in a way, and which is facing a fast deteriorating outlook financially, and it requires radical and urgent action. What would you do in that situation? You'd probably look at staffing across the whole system. Do we need a freeze, for example, around vacancies? You'd certainly look at a Mars scheme. We know we've got a lot more people in the system now. We are less productive than we were. You'd probably look at contractors and consultants. You'd look at balances across all of our trusts. And you'd look at your capital schemes. So I think I know we've made progress on elective care. We're performing better than the other two systems in the Northwest. But are we doing everything to speed up diagnostics and treatments? And are there any major opportunities to improve efficiency there? I think it's important that we're not just lost in the here and now of this financial year, that we don't lose sight of the medium term. That's what will really show whether the ICB is making a difference. It's actually year 2 and year 3, because we were only born in July and the financial year began in April. So we have a group of transformation projects that are now starting to take shape, and I'm confident will make a difference in years 2 and 3. We've got a leader now in place. It will be in place from November onwards for a shared platform, shared services, if you like, across our system. We've got the procurement underway now for bank and agency. We've got a formed discharge and flow project. The name keeps changing, but it's about the connection between the hospital and the community. And we've got some specific projects that are now moving forward on Finney House, on domiciliary care with local government, etc. We've got some transformation projects where they're starting to come together, but we've got to do more work to really firm them up. So clinical integration, the Get It Right First Time programme are examples of that. We need to convert them into the sort of shape we've got those other projects that I mentioned earlier with leadership, proper resourcing going forward. And we've probably got, and I've just come fresh from a 2-day session with our team on what we do going forward. We've got some emerging ideas which we certainly want to talk through with our place-based leaders and our local government colleagues, where I think we can make a real difference in the years ahead. The first one is all about the front and back door of the hospital and the wider community. And I think we've got to recognise that our geography is very different. The issues facing East Pennines, for example, are very different to Cumbria in terms of supply and demand for domiciliary care, for example. But the first area is domiciliary care. We've got a huge shortage of supply nationally and in this region. I've been up to see North Tyneside, where they've launched Northumbria Care. It's the first NHS organisation to be CQC registered to provide domiciliary care. I'm not sure it's the right model for us here in Lancashire and South Cumbria, and I'm not sure we need one model. It may well be we have different ones to match the different needs. But what I do admire about them was the innovation and the boldness that they've taken. Winston Churchill said, "Attitude is a small thing that can make a big difference." And I think we do need to be equally bold going forward. Probably do it differently to the North East, but whatever we do, we need to do it in full partnership between health and local governments. But there could be an opportunity to create a new player in the domiciliary care market going forward. And we should be particularly looking to upskill the care workforce and pay them better wages to provide more value for their patients going forward, such as performing basic medical tasks and becoming a sort of branch, if you like, of primary care as well as providing domiciliary care. That does happen in parts of the country already, and we can do more of that. And it could be a public sector venture rather than simply outsourcing it to the private sector. It needs to be done very, very carefully with tender loving care. The last thing we want to do is destabilise an already fragile care market. So this would need to be a long-term thing done in full partnership with local government, and it needs to feature in our 10-year plan, David. The second area is physical community health services. We already fund these across Lancashire and South Cumbria. We have varied models, we have varied funding levels, and we have different providers across the ICB. So, but one area stands out above the others, that's East Lancashire. I'm convinced it's the best model, but we've got to show that to you and persuade you that that assessment is right. It's delivered by a high-performing team. They get the best outcomes. They've got the lowest level of not meeting medical criteria to reside in the hospital by some margin. It's no accident, and that's a major contributor to that success. So one of the opportunities going forward, rather than challenge, is to roll that sort of model out. You'd begin with Blackburn, with Darwin. You'd certainly look then at Central Lancashire and West Lancashire. And then we'd need to look at what's happening in Morecambe Bay and Blackpool, where they actually have that model, but it's not working as well as East Lancashire. And we'd be fools not to pick the brains and use the talent that we have in East Lancashire to benefit the whole system as well. So there could be some big players to do something about the medium term, and I think we mustn't lose sight of the medium term. The final thing I'd say on the budget is it's not all doom and gloom. When we were discussing the draft budget, we did have a number of full and frank discussions with trusts up and down Lancashire and South Cumbria, and probably one of the most challenging ones was LSC FT. They were partly it was a mindset issue. It's a trust that hadn't had a big deficit, whereas the other trusts had. So I think they were finding it difficult to get their head around the risks around that. And in August, the planning gap at LSCFT was pretty big. But I think we're making really good progress now there under Chris's leadership. And Chris may well want to comment on how they're fast closing the gap. So they are showing it can be done. And one of the things that I think has made a difference was together we appointed a specialist turnaround director to work with Chris and his top team. And there might be, I think there are lessons for the other trusts there as well. So Chris might well want to come onto that. And finally, I'll say a few words about integrated care partnership. So we had our first meeting a few weeks back. Please remember this is different to us, the ICB. This is a community-wide partnership that extends well beyond the health sector. We've got good foundations in Lancashire and South Cumbria. We need this more than others because we've got, you just look at our health outcomes now widening inequalities, we need this. But we've got well-developed and mature health and well-being boards with good needs assessments across the region. And we had a pilot ICS in this area that particularly pushed population health, and that's all really relevant. I'm your rep on that, and Jeff Jalife is also there on the panel as well. And we had our first meeting on the 30th of September. Councillor Michael Green is the new chair. Neil Jack and myself presented the draft strategic direction around the themes of starting, living and leaving well. And I think the partnership agreed that we would keep things simple in the first year. We've got a ridiculous timetable to meet, which is having a draft strategy in place by December to build on the good foundations of the health and well-being boards, and to select a small number of things in those categories that we'll go for, and then we'll have to respond to that in our 10-year plan and 3-year budget early next year. So I think I've said plenty enough. Happy to answer any questions, Chair.
Thanks, Kevin. Very good. Point, question. Debbie first, please.
Thanks, Kevin. It's a really helpful report to sort of help us orientate ourselves through the meeting, and then obviously papers further down the agenda pick up themes. So not to sort of dip in too much. I'm conscious, for example, that the performance report's being discussed later, but I just wanted to sort of raise a challenge really to all of us around the focus through the performance report, because I'm just conscious that we spent quite a long time actually at the last meeting acknowledging that the performance report wasn't quite there. It was a starter for 10, but some very specific feedback about what we'd like to see as a board, and agreement around how important it is that we get the data, the understanding that we need to support good decision making. So the report isn't the only thing that will support that great decision making, but it is absolutely critical, particularly as a new organisation, as a new partnership, to being able to focus in the right area and to be assured that what we're doing is the right thing with the right impact. So I noted the update around the board workshop being planned for December to sort of involve us all in further development, and that the plan is for a revised report to come back to February. I'm just challenging us really, because I think that's too long. So that's another 4 months before we might be expecting a revised report to come back to us that takes on board that feedback. So I wonder if there's things that we can do, or you could give us assurance that those improvements will be made in the meantime ahead of that December workshop, so that we're not standing still and waiting another 4 months before we can see what impact those changes will have.
Thank you. And I knew that question would come, so a bit earlier than I anticipated, but it's great. It is a great question. So there is a lot of work that we need to do to re-engineer the way we look at our data and our business intelligence. And quite frankly, we just don't own all of that ourselves. So some of the information that we need to extrapolate to be able to have those conversations, we get in through the specialist commissioning unit. And again, this board report had to be in on the was it the 16th, I think, of September. Was it 16th? It's just maybe 16th, 17th. And it is just not possible to extrapolate the kind of information we need from the mechanisms we've currently got to look at the data ourselves. We have done quite a bit in month. We've had conversations with the national team around where is the very best evidence of IPRs for ICBs being developed. Some ICBs, sorry to say, David, are ahead of us, and the centre have pointed us into 2 ICBs to look at their papers, which we have started to do. The national lead for Making Data Count, which is looking at all of these issues, does think that we can push ourselves quicker, and unfortunately we don't have a board meeting in January, so the very next time we will be able to bring it will be the February's meeting. But that doesn't mean to say that we won't, as an executive team, be looking at data differently as we go into December and January. We do believe there's a lot of work that we can do in the background. The national team believe that Lancs and South Cumbria Specialist Commissioning Unit is one of the best in the country, and they see them as an extension of their own team. They're already working on some really good improved reports for Morecambe Bay Acute Organisation, for example. So they do believe we can get going, and we can get going fast. But the next board meeting that I think it is realistic to bring information to will be the February one. And again, unfortunately, I don't think we can do the workshop in December. I think there's a plan to move that to January, but it doesn't mean we won't go live with more information in the February board meeting. I think that report, when I look at the draft reports that the Centre have sent me for some of the other ICBs, I get a great deal of confidence about why that data will take us to. One of the recommendations that you'll have seen in the paper is that we've had a task and finish group working since July, and that's what is that's the group that have looked at improving the paper in the way that they have done. We have done to date, But we would welcome a Ned joining us in that group as well. I mean, the more the merrier as far as I'm concerned, but I know that we can't take everybody's time into that group. But I agree with you, it's a really big challenge to us. I was going to say it in my report. I can't, with confidence, take anybody to anything today and say that it is a trend that we should be focused on as opposed to just single movements on data points. And that's not a great place for me to be, for us to be. But we are going at pace, although pace not at where you would like it to be.
Thank you. Righty. Right, let's go. Jane, John, Jim, Kevin. I'll get to everybody, don't worry.
I'd just like to thank Kevin for that, the way you presented that Tale of Two Cities report. I really liked that because it is easy to get just stuck with the challenges, isn't it? And not to just look at opportunities. And I was sort of reflecting when you were talking about how it must feel for staff right throughout the system, because you know you read in the press about morale and how people are feeling and so on, and feeling under pressure and short staff and so on. And I wonder if there's something we can do as an organisation that kind of really sets that tone around hope and innovation and people having a say in shaping changes, because you came up with some great emerging ideas. There'll be loads of ideas from people out the coalface, as it were. And we have to create a culture where people feel they can have a say and they can innovate and improve things. Otherwise, they'll get bogged down with the kind of low morale issues. And it's a sort of pause for reflection, really, on how we can all do that. Yeah. And for James, I guess, in terms of people's strategies. But I think, I would want to be part of a kind of an organisation that really, encourages that if we can.
Just to quickly respond, we are going to launch a staff awards scheme because there's loads of great stuff going on. I visited some of you, Roy will know this, FCMS, social enterprise in Blackpool, employs nearly 900 people, provides a whole range of service, doing some fantastic things. So there's some real nuggets across our system that we need to pick up and celebrate. There's a staff survey underway. Now, I'm not expecting those results to be great because people have been in an uncertain position for actually an extended period. I think the key is that we act on what comes out of it and do something about it. We've got a leadership development program rolling out across the ICB, and we're developing one for the system. So I think there are some things we can use there to take those things forward. But yeah, I agree with you. Let's try and find it, make sure the glass is half full, not half empty.
Thank you, David. And just picking up on one of thank you for the report, Kevin, and just wanted to pick up the issue around domiciliary care. Just to say, firstly, I know from my colleague directors really welcome the focus and the priority that you and the team are giving to that. We know that it's absolutely critical for this winter, but also critical for the longer term. So I really wanted to endorse what you were saying and the priority around domiciliary care. And also that the joint working around it, and you carefully articulated that, which I really appreciate, because if we make an intervention in the market, we want to make the intervention add value and impact, not destabilise the fragility. So really support that. We have a connected group of the four DASs with relevant colleagues. So perhaps offline we can pick up about how I'm happy to take the lead on that with my colleagues to put together something where perhaps we can look at what we might do as an ICB area, but your point around it is different in different parts of the region where we might focus some particular innovation, not least to test something out. And I agree, there is some good learning from the North Tyneside example. So happy to take that action in terms of pulling a meeting together.
Thank you, John. It's very helpful. Got Jim, then Kevin, then I'll move on to the next group.
Okay, thank you. My comment relates to the points you were making, Kevin, about the integrated care system and the integrated care partnership, which are absolutely valid. I understand why they're going for the priorities they're going for in one sense. But later on today, we're going to be looking at this this document about the Equities Commission, which has got a different set of recommendations almost. And I'm personally slightly confused. I know it's not up to us to set the priorities for that board, but we will have to agree the strategy somewhere down the line. And it felt like we got that Equities Commission report which says do this range of things here, which seemed quite logical. The Integrated Care Partnership potentially is going to come up with a different set of, well, links, but different set of priorities. So it's going to come back to us to agree, and I think it'll be quite confusing for us unless we clarify why we got almost two separate approaches to setting priorities for the integrated care system.
Right, that's quite a challenging question to answer. Obviously, we're going to have a session on the HEC report. I think the key with HEC is to integrate it in what we do. So it becomes part of what we do. It's not something separate. So it needs to be considered by the ICB in relation to our 10-year plan and 3-year priorities and 3-year budget. And we won't be able to do 60 things. We're going to have to pick a small number of things that we can make a difference on. So that's the first point. I think the ICP, we're a participant in that. It's not all of, we have to respond to the ICP. The way the legislation's set up, it's a community initiative that will determine its strategy. We then as an ICB have to respond to that. However, it's underpinned by joint working between us and local government, and I'm confident that the ICP will be sensible about what's realistic in the first few years of establishment. We've got good foundations, as I covered on, and inequalities, which is obviously the core of HEC, will feature. There'll be some targeted priorities, I would guess, coming out of the ICP that address that. But it shouldn't be something separate. It should be baked into the core of the ICP strategy, and then we need to respond to that with what are the priorities for our 10-year plan and 3-year budget. So we need to mainstream this rather than have something in a silo.
Thank you. We've got Kevin.
Thanks, David. And I too welcome Kevin's report, and the way you presented it was felt really balanced and fair, so well done on that. I just want to link a couple of items that you talked about. One was the banking agency, and then the other was the overall budget position. And they are clearly intrinsically linked together, aren't they? So the work that we're doing on banking agency, it has been tough to get to this point. I think we've all got the scars, and there's a lot of learning, I think, for all of us in terms of how we take that forward. But I think we're in a good place, and we can really move forward with that now. But I'm sure the board are aware the issue around the bank and the agency and what we're doing now will just give us more control about how do we use bank and agency. It won't get to the fundamental roots of why we're using bank and agency. And the issue about using bank and agency is because we've got too much capacity opening in our system, and we're having to employ staff at very high rates through bank and agency. And the fundamental reason we've got too much capacity open in our system is if you look at even today, we've got 450, 460 unfunded beds because we've got non-medically fit to reside patients within the bed. So what we're doing at the moment really is focusing on the causes, or the symptoms, and we need to get to the fundamental cause of the issue. And that's about how health and social care work together in a very different way so that we can get patients and our residents in the right place and not using hospital beds when they don't need to use those hospital beds. That will then clearly have a fundamental impact on our overall transformation, how we use our staff, how we use our capacity, and will help to reduce our bed numbers. That 460, 450 beds relates to about 15, 16, 17 wards. It's a small district general hospital. Each ward costs approximately 3 to 4 million to run. We can all do the maths. So I think if we can really focus on the causes of what's allowing bank and agency, as opposed to just trying to get that grip and control, we'll get to the fundamental root of the issues that we face. That will then have performance issues. It'll improve performance, it'll improve safety, it'll improve morale because staff are not spread over longer areas and trying to manage across different areas. So I really, really welcome this focus. and really trying to make the links between all of the issues that you've raised in your report, because that's the route of how we'll sort out financial problems. That's the route of how we'll get to the bottom of some of the safety and quality and performance issues.
Thanks, Kevin. It's very good. Right, the next group I've got is Jeff, then James, then Chris.
Thank you, Chair. So I wanted to concentrate just on something completely separate, which is item 3.2, getting it right first time. And it's not really a question to Kevin. It's just a comment and maybe a reflection from Kevin from the Provider Collaborative or David with his work with the various medical leaderships. It's a bit of one of my hobby horses, so forgive me. But I see this as being a statement around how systems and organisations and even departments work. But there's a real good point around the individual here. I worked with this in industry over 20 years ago. The same process, same title, and we saw it having great benefits, but we saw when it went wrong. And it went wrong when individuals didn't take responsibility for doing it themselves. So it's back to the cultures and behaviours thing. So I think there's a really strong message in this about going back to the individual organisations, be they a big trust or a small primary care unit or whatever, that actually it's a really important part of getting your job right. I worked last weekend on call, and the things I saw that were going wrong was when the individuals who dealt with the patients before hadn't got it right first time. So it's a really critical thing. First time doesn't mean in the instant, it means in the episode. So it can be, something that goes on over days or weeks, but you have to get it right for that patient and take personal responsibility for it. I think it's a really important cultural point, as well as the system point, which I think you're making in here, Kevin. So.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, it's David.
So if I could respond to that. So first of all, Jeff, you're right. The Get It Right First Time programme is something that's been running in the trust, the Provider Trust, for a few years now. It's a resource programme, and when the clinicians engage, it is a fantastic opportunity to, you get better care, you get patients home sooner, you utilise less beds. So it's a win-win, and the outcomes are better. Fantastic.
Yeah.
And there's some really brilliant work that's gone in Lancashire and South Cumbria. So what we've done is I've spoken with the medical directors of the Provider Trust. We've collectively agreed 4 areas which we were going to prioritise for this year. We've agreed what the level of ambition is, and we now have a team who are now taking that forward, and we're beginning to undertake that work. Some of it started already, and for example in Morecambe Bay, they managed to release 1,000 bed days by undertaking some work in trauma and orthopaedics. So we're going to be taking that forward. We really want to get some momentum into it, as we've done with virtual wards. Okay, it's a win-win for everybody. Brilliant. The other thing we're doing, because I think you were just talking about primary care, we met with so Lindsay Dickinson, who's from my team, who's an associate medical director for primary care, came and met with the provider medical directors. We're setting up a group, because the other piece of work we need to do is to understand the interface between primary and secondary care. We need to make sure that we get it as right as possible, so that you as a practicing GP know what secondary care will have done, and they know also what you may have done as well. So sometimes there's a bit of misunderstanding, and we need to get that right, because the person who suffers is the patient in the middle. So that was an ask in an Amanda Doyle letter that came out probably about 3 weeks ago. We're going to be taking that forward. We're working with representatives from the trusts to ensure we end up in a better position for the patients.
Thanks, David. Right, I've got James, Chris, Sarah, Roy, Angie, and then I'm going to move us on.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to pick up on the point of the financial position, and Kevin mentioned some of the work that's going on with Chris and the team, and I've got quite close to this work, and I think it's really good. I think there's scalability, I think there's lessons, it's very early, but I think a couple of things have been done really well, 2 in particular. One, there's been some dedicated resource and some very critical challenge from outside of the organisation, which is really necessary. The organisations and systems that turn around challenging financial positions, have to hold a mirror up to themselves, and I think they've done that. and they've done it with some dedicated resource. But probably the most powerful thing is they've supercharged it from a clinical perspective. So the SRO for the work is the medical director. I've been on a call with the medical director, with Chris, and with the turnaround specialist that's gone into the organisation. And what you've got there is that you've got really strong clinical-led programmes that are developing and emerging. So I think I'd invite Chris to just kind of talk a little bit more about it, because I think there's some really good stuff that we can that we can utilise there to see efficiency programmes described by a medic and a medical leader rather than a finance director or is really powerful and really hits to the kind of issues that we're going to have to address and straddles the important worlds of care, quality and efficiency, which are too often seen as disparate and separate.
Thank you, James. Chris?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, James. So, yeah, I think LSCFT hasn't got a great history of recurrent cost improvement. I think the pandemic has just amplified that over the last couple of years. We've been working with the Recovery Director for the last 3 weeks. He's been getting out and about, meeting with clinical and operational teams. And by middle of next week, we will have finalised our programme of both recurrent delivery, but also what you would expect as routine cost control and financial grip. As James said, that clinical thread is really important, and it being owned by everybody. And I'm really clear, and the Trust Board's really clear, that we need to continue on our quality improvements, but that needs to be on a sustainable financial foundation. And I think that's the message that we are taking forward into the organisation.
Well done, Chris. Excellent. Sarah, then Roy, then Angie, please.
Thanks, Chair. I just really wanted to respond to Debbie and try and offer a bit of reassurance. So clearly, developing an integrated performance report that comes to board, that's how we need it, is a big piece of work because of the breadth of KPIs that we actually have responsibility for. But that doesn't mean in the background there isn't quite a lot of oversight of some of our key statutory performance indicators, and we are starting to see these come through the subcommittee. So, Quality Committee last time got quite a lot of CHC data. I know a lot of workforce data went to the People's Board, and teams in the background have got the information they need around things like SEND, learning disabilities, mental health. So a lot of the work is happening. I think the challenge is how we collate it and bring the right sort of report here to board. So it was just to give you some reassurance on that, really.
Thanks, Sarah. Roy?
Thanks, David. Just to thank you, Kevin, for the report. It's well delivered and well received, I think, by us all. Firstly, to refer to FCMS, which you talked about earlier, and something this sort of resonates with something we talked about earlier, which was the COVID vaccinations. And I had my COVID vaccination on an FCM bus that goes around Blackpool and goes into the community. So taking vaccinations into the community to meet, for hard to reach people that we have a lot in Blackpool. So it's really an innovative approach. But just to refer to the strategy, Kevin, that you talked about earlier about the ICP strategy, and James and I attended the Blackpool Health and Wellbeing Board last week, and we talked about a health and wellbeing strategy for that board. Now, I think it's really important. This will be happening in other organisations across Lancashire and South Cumbria. I think it's really important that we ensure that we get all these strategies aligned, because it's about having one strategy. I talked about having a bonfire of the strategies, quite frankly, because we all know how many strategies are lying on, in hidden somewhere within all our organisations, gathering dust. But I think if we have one aligned, integrated strategy, and perhaps when we think about this, we've talked a lot about a medical model. It's not a medical model. It's a medical and social care model, and a real integrated strategy that we need. And I think we talked about at the board last week, Health and Wellbeing Board, about the process of writing that strategy and who we needed to be on board. And we talked about the ICB strategy as well that we've already put together. So I think it's really important when you have those meetings in the ICP forum that you talk about bringing all these strategies together into one place, because it's no good as all sitting in different rooms in different organisations talking about strategies. and say, well, we might have a 3-year strategy, we might have a 10-year strategy, we might have, you know, a 20-year strategy. It's something I think that we need to absolutely bring together and make sure we're very much aligned on. Thanks, David.
Just to unpack the FCMS story, I mean, I was really energised from that visit. Fantastic organisation, doing a wide range of contracts. I think their first contract was, I think it was a sort of urgent calls, wasn't it? But they do work in Yorkshire and the Midlands now. They work with Esther Ranson's Childline. They work with NWAS. Really impressive organisation. My main takeaway from that is there are lots of other examples around our system like that. Who are the upper quartile performers in our system? Why can't we do more with them and lengthen our relationships? It's a simple thing, and that should be part of our strategy. And I've tasked Jane Cass, who works in our partnership team, to look at who are the high performers across our system and why can't we do more with them going forward. When I had the conversation, David and I visited, we spent half a day with FCMS, I said to them, with our contracts, what's the typical length? They said they're all annual. All of them are annual. So why can't we have a long-term partnership with FCMS? It then gives them, it then allows them to focus the money on the front line rather than all the bureaucracy of renewals. And it also gives them greater certainty because it's a social enterprise to be able to recruit people on a longer term basis. And I know I've had the conversation with, I think there's big opportunities in the voluntary sector to do this sort of thing going forward, and it becomes a win-win, and it's not all about more money, it's about more certainty, actually. So some big opportunities there.
And the last word, Angie?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to pick up on the point that Jim made about the HEC, and I won't talk about the HEC specifically because we've got a conversation about that. But of course, with local authorities, we co-design the ICP with Kevin and his team, and we see the HEC as very much another stream of evidence to run alongside the evidence base that we already have, which will then influence the health and care strategy. Which will be set in the broader context, looking at our population health and our financial constraints and our technical and innovative opportunities as well. That in turn will come back to the ICB when we can use that evidence to decide how we want to allocate our resources and deliver that through both the place-based partnerships and other organisations which are already established. It's probably worth just referring to the Lancashire 2050 plan as well, the 27-year plan, to get us to where we want Lancashire to be. The HEC evidence will also feature in that alongside other things, and it will be very influenced by what the ICP recommend. And it would be good at some time if we could perhaps have a conversation at the board about the Lancashire 2050 plan, because that will go out to consultation, and we want to engage more stakeholders with that, and clearly the ICP is a key stakeholder in that.
Thanks, Angie. We'll get that on the list. I think that the most important thing, you know, that the architecture, the partnership, our board, all the other pieces that have been referred to in this discussion, have differently defined roles, but the success in this is the way in which we get real alignment on it. We won't be following the example of His Majesty's Treasury and the Bank of England in the way that we play out some of our discussions maybe, but whilst respecting that the roles are very different and the responsibilities are very different, the world judging us wants to see that we have a way of aligning all of that and a consistency of purpose and a clarity about priorities and resources. And I'm very confident that we can work together to do that. But the risks that colleagues have raised in the discussion are very real. We simply need to stand up and take them on and work through it. Yeah. Right, thank you. Sam, we've had quite a bit of discussion about some of the financial challenges and the good work going on in LSC, FT and other things, but to you now, please, to summarise all of that for your report.
Thank you very much. And I'll try not to repeat some of the things that have been said, because there's quite a bit been said around the finances. But I'm not proposing to go through the paper in the pack. It's the position as at month 5 for the ICB. But I just want to draw out a couple of points, really. And I think, you know, we're 35 million off plan at the end of the 5 months, which is not a good position, is it? We don't want to be here. And I suppose, not to take away some of the context that we've heard today, it's important to understand that, you know, COVID is continuing. We have that level of acuity in the system, and yet we've had 57% of our COVID budget reduced, which was over 100 million going into this year. We've got increasing sickness, and we heard from Anushka before about the impact that that's having on our staff. And we've got social care, you know, sort of the capacity that we know isn't there, and the non-medically fit to reside patients in beds, as Kevin McGee talked about. So that's the backdrop to this. But our leadership challenge is that we have to do both, and we have to keep trying to do both, and we need to try and meet this target at the end of the year. And so we know we've got all the things lined up. We've got some great ideas, and Kevin's talked about a number of them today, and that's what we need to get to. But I think we've got 3 key focus areas for us, really, as a team and as a board and a system. And that's the short term. Short term, we've got to do everything we can this year to get as close or to balance our position and meet our targets. Medium term is the programmes of work that we've really talked about, and sort of the flow work that we've talked about is absolutely key. But how do we shut or down temporary capacity when we actually are going to need it in the system? What's the alternative to that? The other areas of programmes that we need to look at in the medium term, definitely we've talked about bank and agency, and we've talked about there's elective recovery, and then the clinical and corporate work. So they're the 5 programmes of work. And then the long term is how do they turn into more transformational work that we're talking about to really drive out the long-term financial savings. And just on the flow one, you know, how do we sort of look at that this year to help, or going into next year to help us in the medium term? But longer term, what could that model look like into intermediate care and really sort of supporting people? So loads to do. But if we look at our 35 million off plan, 20 of that, or 19 of that, relates to us as an ICB. And that was the first 3 months of the CCGs existing, where we didn't have SIP plans in place, and we had a lot of pressures on, and we continue to do around packages of care. But the budget has been profiled into 12th, so we've got some catching up to do. There is a plan for us to do that, and we need to make sure we balance at the ICB level. The 16 million off plan for the providers really reflects the level of SIPs. And I think what's worrying me more than anything at the moment is the level of SIPs that are non-recurrent. So we should have been aiming this year for 60% of those CIP plans in providers to be recurrent, and by the end of the year catch up with a full lot. We're actually only at 10%. And that's a real worry for 2 reasons. One is that takes away, because what's happening is, because we're replacing recurrent plans with non-recurrent opportunities, those opportunities could have been there to manage the risk more this year, and they're not, because we don't have the recurrent plans. But more worryingly is what that's doing to our recurrent position as we move into next year. So I am worried, and I think we need to do more, and we have to do more to address this. So what's not in the paper, because I guess what the paper does, it is a bit like a spectator paper, isn't it? It tells you where we are now, and I think we've touched on some of the actions today. And what I will think about going forward is how do we really describe in that paper what we are actually doing about this, because it's really important that we have the action on that. I think the first thing to tell you, and we've mentioned it, is we're doing a very forensic review at month 6. I've got the full team in place now in finance. We've had this 8 CCGs come into one. We're still battling with that, but it's coming together, and we've got the team. But the team are now working with the trust, and there's some very clear deadlines of getting information back to do a very forensic line by line. Where are we? What is the risk? What have we got opportunities? We've got this. So that's happening. I suppose the other part that I've got now, I've got the team as well, is each of those programmes I mentioned before, I've got a dedicated senior finance colleague that's sitting on those teams and driving some of that to support it, which will help. I think the assurance meetings that I've been having, I've had monthly meetings with all of the directors of finance in all of the trusts throughout the year. And I suppose why I'm escalating the SIP plans is because there were some deadlines around getting those recurrent plans in place. And it might be helpful if we heard from any of the trust colleagues about where they think they are with that. But there's a real ask that the board get to grips on those recurrent plans now, and we need to get them in place. But what's going to be really helpful is, because of the landscape we're talking about with the operational pressures, I can't talk to my finance colleagues in provider trusts on their own. It needs to be a wider discussion. And what we're talking about doing with the assurance meetings on a quarterly basis is Maggie's now going to become more involved in that. So we're looking at the wider finance and performance agenda with those trusts and looking at some of the plans around that. And what's been happening in the meantime, we've done two, I guess, big sort of pieces of work around where we think some of the pressures are. One we've heard about with LSCFT today, and I think that is a good model, and James is absolutely right, that's worked really well, and we've heard from Chris, and we need to think about, is that a model we need to use in other organisations now? So we're looking at that. And the other one is to do a bigger deep dive into sort of where Morecambe Bay are, because they do have the biggest planning risk. And during that sort of review, what has come out of that is that the planning risk has reduced. It's not gone away, but it's reduced. There has been some identification of things that aren't going to happen in there, which will be stopped. But also looking at their SIPs, they are doing better on the recurrent SIPs, and I think they are starting when we need that from everybody really. So there are lots of pieces of work that go down, but we need to take every effort now to make sure that we can try and balance this year and get as close as we can. But my aim is to still try and balance the plan, whilst we have a real focus on not taking our eye off the ball recurrently, otherwise we're going to stack up the problem for next year and beyond. So I guess I'm happy to take any questions on the paper. I'm not going to go through the detail in the paper, but they were more of the key messages around the agenda, really.
Well done. Sheena first, please.
Thanks very much for that very clear overview. One of the things I've been reflecting on as we've kind of moved through the meeting today is this sense of, and it was mentioned earlier, about treating what we do together as one organisation, one sense. So what we've heard today is about that what we've got is this sense about increasing need from our population. And that's obviously driving all sorts of things, not least of which is an increase in cost and the way we respond to that. So, and what we've heard is the need to really have that across the whole of our population response. Is thinking about, first of all, how do we meet need more effectively? So, and how do we deal with need that we've got more effectively, and taking that right across what we do. And then thinking about how do we use our resource to do that together. So what I'm kind of reflecting on is this sense about moving away from, yes, it's really important to look at individual organisations, positions, but that sense about how do we join that together to say, okay, how is the resource being used at the moment? How effective is that being used? And how can we do that bit about, as you beautifully described, the short and the medium and the longer term approach to that. So that's something I think perhaps we just might want to think about as we move forward, and think particularly about the integration opportunities, starting, I think, with people where they live their lives in their communities. And we've heard already today about the excellent work that's being done by third sector organisations, and actually thinking about meeting that need in a very different way. And then how do we then take that through everything we do? So that was just a thought really about how we look at things. So thanks, Sam.
I mean, it's a really important point, Sheena, and I think what we're doing, I suppose, if you're thinking about the short, medium and long term, is my ambition with this is to absolutely get the money in the right place and to make sure that we're using population health and we're using the allocation formula properly for our population, and not to keep looking at individual organisations, but to look at that collectively for our population. So with short term, what we're doing on that is we're doing a lot of work on the financial framework, the allocation formula, and how we can drive that properly. But I'd be setting myself up if I said we're going to be ready with all that, by the end of this year, because it's going to take some time because we need to do it properly. But we're doing lots of work, and there is a dedicated part of the finance team that is working on that framework. I think part of the transformation that Kevin's described needs to be thought about within that, and how, you know, with the sort of movement. So what we're doing is a 3-year budget by the end of December, coming for the last quarter of the year. But it's got to underpin that 10-year plan, and within that there's going to be major transformational change, isn't there? So we need to make sure the money follows through. So when we're going to talk about a finance strategy and a financial plan, we can't just talk about a finance, we need to talk about an investment and disinvestment and putting things in the right place. So we haven't got all the answers yet, but it's a really helpful comment, because that's part of our work that we're definitely focused on, and it's in my objectives this year to do that design work.
Thank you. Got Roy, Angie, Sarah.
Thanks for the paper, Sam. I mean, it referenced earlier when Kevin was talking about backloading the savings to month 3 and 4, which I think really worries me, and I should worry us as a board, to be quite frank with you. But I don't want to focus on that, and I'm going to break a rule that I said something about at the last meeting, was that if there's anything technical in any of the papers, they should ask the authors of the papers before they come to the meeting, and so I'm just going to break that rule now, Sam, and it's on the run rate provider run rate that's going up, as you know. But in that particular table that you've provided for us there, it refers to the month 5 average and then the adjusted average. But for both Blackpool and East Lancashire, those are the same. So does that mean that they've not had any income over that time to change that run rate, to change that from the average to the adjusted?
Yes,
it does. So
yeah.
they've had no income.
So what we've done is we've worked with all the providers on things that
right, okay.
and we've adjusted on that basis. Yeah.
Okay, that's all it was. Thank you. Thanks.
And Angie, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Kevin and Sam. I think you've been very clear with us about the issues and your concerns here, and they build on the conversations that we had on the last board. I'm deeply conscious, having run regimes like this in the past, that of course people are, you know, we have running towards pleasure people who will do things because it's going to be better, but actually people won't change their behaviours unless it's uncomfortable for them to remain within the status quo. So there's a bit about how we are making it uncomfortable for people to stay in the status quo, because previously, Sam, you've given us a very clear set of documentation which has shown that there are a lot of efficiency issues, picking up on Sheena's point, within our existing system, which is in our gift to fix, which we have not done. And that's a Lancashire and South Cumbria issue, not a national issue. But most importantly, what is the consequence for us as a board and for us as a system if we underspend? I think it's really important that we understand what those consequences are, because they will or they won't dictate the level of discomfort that will encourage people to shift their behaviours. Thank you.
I'll come back to you on that one, Kevin, after I've taken Sarah's point.
Thanks, Chair. It was also just reflecting on all the discussions this morning about the big challenges and the need to be information and transformation, and then Sheena's point about needing to come together and work as a system. I suppose it was a plea, particularly in your quarterly meetings that you talked about, and Maggie joining you. You need to bring the clinicians into those discussions. You know, it doesn't have to be me and David, but I think our lead clinicians in those providers, because some of the answers here lie in how we do things differently along those pathways, and we need to bring them with us on that journey at the same time.
Thank you. I'll ask Kevin to pick up this really important point about consequences, because it plays into what we were discussing before about operating models and so on and so forth. And the world's changed a lot since 2006. The NHS as a whole overspent by a mere 485 million for England in 2006, and the Chief Executive and Permanent Secretary in Department of Health were removed from their positions because of this situation, and the numbers have moved on since then, and the ways of. And my own feeling is that, particularly with through the pandemic period and the need to respond very rapidly to this unprecedented pressure in that period, both the rules of the game got compromised at the same time in terms of delivery of statutory duties and personal responsibilities. the eye was taken off some of that in order to get through it, and the finance regime changed significantly during that period, so it all became less messy. But we're now going to return to a period where this issue comes back to the sort of discussion in the operating model of, as Kevin described before, who does what where. Before I ask Kevin to give his thoughts on that bit, I've just one. It's an open question to the group really, but I'm particularly looking to Chris and to Kevin McGee, which is this. And as we've gone through these changes to the finance regime, we have a contradiction, in my view, when we look at the books now, which is there's a significant overcommitment in terms of recurring expenditure on a week-by-week, month-by-month, year-by-year basis. At the same time that there's big cash balances in the trust, and this is a product of the regime that we have. But my fear is, Sam, that the availability of significant cash balances in the balance sheet is a liability, not an asset, because it makes us think that we can put off the tough decisions to another day. And it's a question of, is that really part of the mentality? And if so, how do we break through that? Because I see it like a credit card balance. You can overspend each month and keep building your credit card debt up, but you actually get to the point where you hit your limit, and there's nothing, there's nowhere else to turn at that point. And if you haven't made the recurring savings, you're in a bit of bother. Is that a factor, Kevin?
I don't believe it is, David. I suspect it may have been if you went back 12 months, but I don't believe it's currently the situation. And I believe each of the individual provider boards, the executives and the chief execs within each of the providers, are really focused upon trying to get that balance between keeping things safe in the short term with all the pressures we've identified and the performance issues, and making sure we do recurrent transformation that's going to drive the costs out. So there is a real focus on that within each of the individual providers. But I have to come back to what I said before. The primary driver of the cost base in each of the providers is our bed base that we have open, because that drives the staff that we have to employ to manage those beds. And whilst we have patients in those beds who should be cared for elsewhere, we've got unfunded capacity open. So we've got to get to the cause of the issues that we face. And if as a system we can all work together properly and really try and get back into our recurrent bed base, that will drive out the cost, a large proportion of the costs in the system, and will allow the reduction in the use of bank and agency that then has flow-on issues in terms of quality and safety. So I suspect, I can't sit here now and say that we are going to close capacity this winter. The current position is that we've got occupancy rates of 98% within the system, probably in excess of 98% within the system. But what we have to do is, working with Sam and working with Kevin and colleagues across the system, is to have those recurrent plans in place so that as we come out of this winter and we come into the spring, we can very quickly close down that excess capacity that sits within the system and take out those costs. So there is a real focus on that within providers. We absolutely get the need to deliver in terms of recurrent cost savings. There is an absolute focus on other areas as well. So we've talked about Girth, we've talked about model hospital, we've talked about theatre efficiencies, and we have to drive all of those through at the same time. So the answer to your question, David, no, I don't believe that there is that attitude within providers anymore. I believe there's a real focus on trying to drive out the costs, and I believe this is a timing issue about how do we manage safely through this winter, and how do we put those recurrent plans in place to take out excess unfunded capacity.
Very good summary. And just before I move on, to come back to Angie's point then about, in the sort of accountability operating model world, how do we respond when things aren't going as the way that we expected?
Thanks, Chair. I think there's a short-term thing around, there's a guy called Julian Kelly he's a Lancashire lad, but he's the CFO of the NHS England. And if we're not careful, in terms of this year, Julian will be doing our job rather than us. That's what's happened in some ICBs already, where there are weekly meetings and there are some pretty onerous controls. So I think we've got to really own this agenda. I think in the longer term, and I'm thinking months, not years, we need to flesh out what the operating model should be. I think it is actually up to us to figure out what the right framework is, what the right carrots and sticks are in our system. It hasn't been defined for us, is the honest truth. I do think we need to, but it's all the normal rules you'd expect, Room 101, be clear on what the direction of travel is and what the ask is probably the most important thing, so everyone knows what's expected of them. And I then think we need to then translate that into things like carrots about what financial allocations might be. If you're a high performer in these areas, you get freedoms and flexibilities. You might get your commissioning lengthened, that sort of thing. But then what's the consequence side, the stick side, might be some of the reverses of that. It might affect the allocations. It might affect actually more intrusive controls and occasionally direction. So I think that's exactly what we need to flesh out. But the best place to start is to be really clear on what's expected, because I think if we're really clear on what's expected, most organisations respond fully to that. So I think, it's our gift really. So I think we need to work that through with you, and we have got someone in mind. I don't want to say that, confirm that person until it's absolutely confirmed, but she has a lot of great experience in both provision and commissioning in the health world, and is a well-recognised figure.
Thank you. Well done, Sam. Anything you want to say finally?
Just one thing, just to Sarah's point really, because I think it is a really important point about the clinicians. One of the things we're doing, and it's sort of in advance of the operating model coming out, and it touches on Angie's point as well. Tomorrow, all the directors of finance across the system are coming together to look at what that sort of operating assurance sort of piece looks like between us all, and firm that up, and how we're going to work together. So we've got a day on that tomorrow. I would have envisaged, because we were looking at things like the QRM meetings that they used to have in Monitor with Trust. We're not the regulator, we're not doing that, but actually there is some real good evidence of how that worked well with clinicians involved. So we'll have a think about how we build that into it. It's a good point, thank you.
Very good. Nice lead into your performance report, Maggie.
Thank you. And as Debbie highlighted earlier, I think we're all disappointed with the performance report that is in front of us. And I've tried to give you some explanations of why we're going to have to continue with a suboptimal report for a number of months. I also thought it would just be useful to say we don't actually have a performance function within the ICB, and I think that might be a surprise to some of you. We've gone, as Sam said, from the 8 CCGs now into our new organisation, and we've mapped across into performance 7 people. So that's 5 that work on performance and 2 that will work on BI and performance as well. And I can honestly, absolutely offer my thanks to those people, if any of them are listening to today, and I've actively encouraged them to do that, because they have worked really hard to get this report into where it was. Those 8 people have worked across different CCGs, and the expectations on them and the data that they were working on has shifted considerably since July. It isn't that they lack ambition to work in a different way. I absolutely have worked with them late into the evenings in the build-up to this report coming in, so that we could start to think about performance in a different way. I will take back to the national team the comments, Debbie, and see what we can bring, if there is any way we can make any shifts in December. But while people were talking, I was just quickly counting up. I think we've got something like this 7 working days from today to when the next report has to be in. So trying to get meetings with the CSU. We've got a great colleague joining us in November when Asim Patel joins us as our new Chief Digital Officer, and I've had long conversations with him about his experience with performance scorecards and working with the CSU as well. So I'll go back to them and talk about how we can push ourselves. but again, in the spirit of it being 30 days till we submit December's performance report, I just want to try and manage everybody's expectations. Sarah was absolutely right to point out that the world doesn't stop because we haven't got an IPR here that satisfies our expectations. And I know the directors present who are overseeing these portfolios, cancer, UEC, etc. We want to talk about some of the progress that we're making, and more importantly, I think about the scale of the ambition, because a lack of the IPR at this stage shouldn't in any way make us feel that we don't lack ambition. Kevin mentioned a couple of things in his report, didn't he, about are we doing all that we can for our population? And I think at the moment I am offering you all we can on a limited infrastructure to actually see an aggregated position. But that doesn't mean to say that people aren't working really hard at ground floor level, particularly in the areas where we know we've either got deprivation or underperformance, to actually try and lift the standard. We touched on, or Sam touched on, the need that we've got, an intense need to be able to work at sub-board level on both our performance and the implications that has with our finance. And again, we are planning to mock up something during the end of October and into November, so that we can, like Sarah alluded to earlier, with quality and workforce, be able to really start to interrogate the data outside of this meeting, so that we're offering high level trends and we're really focusing our attentions on the right areas. So I think in the spirit of context, I've probably covered the architecture, and I think what's important is that we have a little bit of opportunity to talk about what the data's actually showing us. I think the other thing, just for context though, we have to work really closely with the Provider Collaborative Board. There are mechanisms that exist within there, such as the Elective Recovery Board, that we need to really understand the implications. And it may be, Kevin, I'm putting you on the spot now, but in the absence of this IPR being developed in the way that we want, there may be something that we can fit into this in December from that function as well, where we can look at the data that they're seeing in a bit of a close way. I haven't been to any of those meetings yet. I've just not had time in there since I've started to be able to go. So there is more that we will look to do. And I'll pause there, David, if that's okay, and we'll just take questions on from anybody, but particularly on what the data that we've currently got is telling us.
Thank you, Maggie. And you know, from the scorecard in the appendix, but also from the body of the report, there's clearly very significant issues in cancer, in elective care, in urgent medical care. And we're going to come on to talk more about urgent and emergency care as we enter the winter period. But open up for comments. Jim, then Kevin, then Sarah.
Thanks. Well, first of all, I'm very concerned when Maggie says there isn't a performance function within the organisation. This is a key responsibility of the organisation. You have got to have a performance function within the organisation. You need analytical skills to tell us what this is saying. There isn't a great deal of information here to actually comment on, to be honest with you, Maggie. So I know you're saying let's focus on the information, but there's not that information. It's relatively bland. We need to get underneath that to understand what's going on. In the absence of anything else, you could almost give us the performance reports from the trusts and primary care, so at least we would have a better feeling for what's happening across the patch. But it's quite disturbing. I've also been through the process of this working group, by the way, when you bring someone in from the department to develop the performance report, and that's basically all they do. They just kind of help you to develop a format for reporting, which, in all honesty, kicks a ball into long grass. You know, what they say is don't address anything unless there's sort of six occasions when it's sort of out of line with the average, and basically nothing happens. So the organisation I was in, we went from a performance report where we were addressing issues as they arose to one where we waited a few months and then another few months, and basically nothing took place. So I'm slightly concerned that that's our approach to resolving the fact that we need performance information now, so we can be understanding what the issues are and addressing them here and now, basically.
Thank you. So perhaps I didn't explain that adequately, Jim. Sorry if I didn't. we've appointed now a director for performance that will work with me. My portfolio will have performance, and the director that we've appointed hasn't started yet, but will start imminently. Then we're going to have delivery, which is planned and unplanned, and then we've also got EPRR, which we're coming on to later in the agenda as well. So we will develop a performance function, and we will determine over the next few months what we need to bring back in-house and what we can still do with the CSU. I have to politely disagree with you in relation to the making data count function at the department. I've worked with them on the Isle of Wight, and they transformed our performance reports, and it certainly didn't give us inertia for 6 months. It was one of the key things that we did with the centre that enabled us to exit SOF 4 and the old special measures. So again, we have to have something to help us improve, and I've got previous experience of working with them and seeing that happen. The test of time will show whether or not that it helps us or not, but it is the best in market that we've got free to us in the NHS at the moment to help us real time. But again, you know, you're very welcome to join us and be part of the shaping of that work, Jim. We would welcome you. And we, you know, in the spirit of the less than 10 days to get this paper in from starting, we did look at whether or not we should just bring the performance scorecards from the individual organisations. But to be quite honest, it was massive amounts of information. It's helpful to those individual organisations, but it doesn't aggregate up well when you do it in such a crude way. But again, if members think that that would be helpful, I'm perfectly prepared to look at that. But again, in the spirit of not having the function developed yet, it will be extremely difficult to offer you aggregated triangulation from seeing the data in that way.
Thanks, David. And just say welcome, Maggie. Look forward to working with you. And I think, you know, your understanding and experience of the acute sector, I think, will be really helpful in terms of the work as we go forward. Just an offer really to work with you in terms of how we pull these reports together, because we always talk, don't we, about one version of the truth, and what we need to have is reports, and picking up on Jim's point, you know, the same data source feeding both provider and ICS reports, so we know it's an accurate reflection and it is that one version of the truth. 'Cause I think that's really vital that we get that right. And there is a lot of data in the system. So, for instance, I've just been on the regional leadership group this morning, and they've showed in real detail all the elective recovery in Lancashire and South Cumbria, summarised and compared to Cheshire and Mersey and Greater Manchester. So if we look around the various sources, there is a lot of data that we can pull and we can aggregate that will give us both benchmarked information and absolute information about individual organisations. So I do believe it's there. It's just where we pull it from and making sure we've got that one version of the truth. And it's an offer to work with you and alongside you to pull that together.
Thank you. We've got Sarah, Jeff, Ibby, Angie.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, I think there's a few of the metrics in here that are deeply concerning, so I'm not going to go into them all. I suppose the comment on all of them is, I think it's the comment I made last time, I think also when we're developing the report, we really need to understand the variation across the patch, because even where something's poor and we're saying, well, it's but it's a bit better than the national average, we will have elements of our community where it isn't 50%, it's actually probably only down at 10%, and I think it's really important with our inequalities agenda that we do that. But the metric I in particular wanted to really bring to our attention is the one around learning disability health checks. So people living with a learning disability and or autism are amongst our most vulnerable, and there are a number of metrics we get measured on and we're not really performing well in any of those, and the health check is a really, really important part of supporting those individuals, of checking any risks, etc. It's a primary care challenge. It was a challenge before ICBs, it's been a challenge across CCGs even before COVID, but I just think it's really important we're cited on that as a group, and I just maybe wanted to remind the board, or maybe you didn't know, that one of the asks from NHS England as we established was, who is your executive lead for learning disabilities and autism, which is actually me. But, you know, it's high on the national agenda, it's high on the local agenda, and we really, really need to do some targeted work. I've just establishing a team around this, and we are going to get all over it, but probably a plea maybe just after Christmas. I think bringing a focused piece of work back to the board just to understand that group and the services we offer and where our report performance is probably something that we should do.
Thank you. Look forward to that. Jeff, then, maybe.
Thank you, Chair. The advantage of going after Sarah is she said everything I wanted to say, because it's exactly what I wanted to say, but I just add two little things, because I think the mark of a civilised society is how you look after your most vulnerable. We can't do everything. We've got a lot of problems, but this is a group that's suffered badly through the pandemic, and I think they deserve better attention. 2 points I want to make. Well, one's a point and one's a question about the data, and that's just me. It's not the way you present it. It's just the point I want to make is I think there's huge variation in primary care on this. I've seen some primary care who are in old data from our days in Morecambe Bay hitting nearly 100%, and others hitting nothing at all. So it can be done. Primary care can do this, so we need to understand how they do it and spread that. My question actually is, I'm just confused about the data, because I look at the graph on page 43 and it says 77% in March 23, and then I look down at 19.8% now. And how do those two correlate? I mean, it's just me understanding what the...
I can't answer that now. Sorry.
Right. Okay. I just looked at the figures and I thought, how does it go from one to the other? And I wasn't quite understanding what it meant really. But okay.
I'll go back and I can answer that for you.
Yeah.
But I've asked as many questions about this data as you could possibly wish me to.
Yeah. But I think looking at the variation in the data from practice to practice and place to place might be useful. It usually stimulates my colleagues when they are on a league table.
Ibby? Yeah, thanks, Maggie. I kind of understand. You set out the challenges around some of this, and I fully very sympathetic to kind of where we are around some of this. I guess the real interesting bit from my perspective is where's the work going to happen in terms of this board being able to influence which metrics we decide are really important in terms of giving us the assurance we need. What we've got here is a selection, and I think clearly we need to broaden those, but also be really careful we don't overwhelm ourselves. So there's a real bit of thinking we need to do in terms of the metrics that we need to monitor. And the other bit is there's a range of approaches out there in terms of how these things look. So again, I'd welcome the opportunity for us, maybe in a workshop, to have a bit of a discussion around the approach. What we did at Lancashire Teaching, which I found really helpful, was do quite a bit of work in terms of understanding natural variation. You know, that kind of noise that gets in the way and actually takes us down the wrong path of interrogation, and really be clear about what tolerance levels we need to have around each of those metrics before they cause us a bit of concern. So I think there's some really good practice out there already, and maybe we don't need to actually reinvent the wheel to a large degree when we kind of decide our own approach.
Thank you. Just come back on a couple of points if I may, David. Going back to Kevin's point earlier about there's a lot of data already. There is, but we all use different platforms to extrapolate that data. The good news for us is that we do purchase the right platforms, but we just haven't got them switched on, providing us with the data. So we will be able to work with Kevin and the providers in a smarter way. We just haven't yet had the switched on the relevant platform. So that is all good news, because from a technical perspective, I think that won't be as long as going out to procure the platforms that we need. So more to follow on that. And again, I absolutely agree with you, Ibu. We, because of the breadth of the organisation now that we are here to represent, and this huge breadth of statutory constitutional targets across all of the services, we really do need to have the ability to talk at sub-board level about what are the really pertinent issues, the escalation up to this board. have to have some way of having a level of confidence that things are happening through executive functions and other committees that really does give us the opportunity to get into the space that we want to be. The workshop is key because we've got a breadth of people around this table who are used to seeing data in different ways, and we've also got a huge amount of experience in different sectors. And of course, if we're not careful, we could end up with a report that just takes us off in the wrong place. So I haven't got all of the answers, and I'm absolutely determined not to sit here like some smart aleck who has got all the answers, because we need to agree those things in workshop mode, and we need really good facilitation to bring us back to what is the purpose of an ICB, what's the purpose of providers, and what is the data that we really should be examining in a detailed way. I'm as disappointed as others that we can't bring that, we can't fast forward and put more hours in the day, but I genuinely look forward to being in partner into that workshop with everybody.
Angie?
Thank you. And Maggie, I feel your pain on all of this. You are not alone. There are lots of us who are in exactly the same position, so I absolutely get that. Sort of just comparing what we've got here to what we had last month. What I see in terms of the ICB is declining performance aligned to a declining financial performance. And given that we do only have a limited number of indicators, I would ask the board, or indeed those who are actually working in the system, if that is a fair reflection, because I think we need to understand that, whether we see ourselves in the data that we have, albeit the fact that that might not be brilliant data. Assuming to some degree we do, I think certainly I might recognise that. I would want some clarity about what we're doing on that. And actually throughout this board discussion, particularly from Kevin's paper and Sam's paper, I've had little nuggets of lots of things that are going on to address both some of the performance outcomes and some of the financial challenges. But it's not quite coming together for me as a cohesive picture, and that's probably something we need to be working on, so we can have confidence that we know stuff is happening and we know when we expect that stuff to start coming through in the indicators, and then we trust our executives to get on and do their stuff type things. So that's kind of like where I'd like to get us to. In terms of some slightly more detailed things, in terms of the balanced scorecard, I think it's a better scorecard than last time, but I did just clock that everything in strengthening social care is about the acute hospitals, so I don't think we're quite in the right mindset, and I think we're still very much here about clinical and hospital rather than community and population health. So that workshop, I think, is going to have to be really important about getting that shift and driving that stuff forward. And hopefully, if that's after the integrated care strategy has come forward, albeit embryonic, that might help shift some of that thinking and focus. I just wondered that the grading of finance as orange as opposed to red was realistic and not perhaps, optimistic, and we might want to reflect on that. And then there's a challenge about, do we think these ratings are right? And so that goes back to my first question. Do we recognise ourselves in this data? But the most important thing for me is that we start to get a sense about when the actions are going to come forward and start showing a difference both in our financial and our operational performance, so that we can support the team in their work. Thank you.
It's very good times. We'll hold on to that point, Kevin. I'll come to you at the end of the discussion. Thank you, Angie. David, and then James, and then I'll come back to Kevin and we'll move on.
Okay, 3 points very quickly. First of all, the conversation we're just having reflects the challenge of having a report card, a performance card, which we can understand the data, but the data is presented to us in such a way that we can have some informed analysis of the figures. And Jeff's point was really good, because the data that we looked at for the learning disabilities, it was presented saying that we achieved 64% of our trajectory for Q2, and this is approximately 90% of the national average figure. we'd have gone, oh, okay. But the other thing is that as we do this, a couple of points we picked up. First of all, I've worked in a trust where we had 3 sites. I knew that if we presented the average figure to the board, I could hide a lot of stuff. I didn't want to hide a lot of stuff, and of course we knew what the issues were. But we've got to be careful that we understand where the individual, the places where their data is as well. And we also need to take into account the national data as well. So, as this is a public board, my second point is just to reflect that we as an executive do understand that there are some challenges. First of all, with cancer. You can see the cancer report there, it's very red. This is a national issue, in fact. You may have seen in the papers about many women being referred through the breast to eat weight, many younger women, in fact, when it's inappropriate. But we do have increased demand, as was reflected in last month's report. And it is a concern for myself and the other members of the executive team. And we are going to work to develop a cancer recovery plan. And we do have some very fragile specialist surgical services at present, and we've been working with the regional team. And then the other one, just to flag up, is around the out-of-area placements, where Sam and I had a really good meeting with Sheena to discuss that. Working with Chris, we're working on, again, a plan which should be available next month or 2, so that we can not only, as we discussed last month, increase the bed base where necessary, but there is significant redesign work going on within the trust around flow, as well as development of community services, so patients once again can avoid admission. So just to offer yourself as the board, but also members of the public who may be viewing this, that we do have insight into some of those areas of concern, and we're going to take action.
Thank you, David. James?
Yeah, just to pick up 2 points very quickly, and to give some reassurance, and also to just to be clear that I think we have got an emerging approach that will work, and I know Maggie's looking to broaden this across the other domains, but just to use the workforce reporting domain as an example of that. So we are, to Kevin's well-made point around it, needing to get to a single version of the truth. We are there now with the workforce numbers, so we take the workforce numbers from the provider returns. Not only that, we validate them, and I validate them with the workforce leaders across the patch, so that we know that we are all looking at the same thing. So members of the People Board will know that we've now got to quite a rich data set we've been able to bring, and we know that this is in line with the provider return. So we've got I think we're getting to a good place with that. Also, in terms of the variation, so you look at the quite scant numbers that appear in this report from a perspective of workforce. Actually, behind that, what we've done as a People Board in the first meeting, we had a much more detailed report that showed the variation underneath those headline numbers. And an action that we agreed from the meeting actually was that we, wherever the variations are, we're having a dialogue now with the providers where variation sits, and we're looking at answering 2 questions. One, what's happening within, what is that individual provider doing about that variation? And 2, what are we doing as a system to support that individual provider in terms of that variation? So 2 questions. What can the individual provider do alone? What can they do as a system? What support? How can we all help and wrap around that? So I think we've got an emergent model there and a way forward. I think that, I know Maggie's looking to broaden that out and roll that out. So it was really just to give people a bit of assurance there on that.
Very helpful, thank you. And Kevin, back to you to sum up.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think we need to remember the context here. We've got a system under immense pressure and dramatic increases in need and demand for services, and a tired workforce. All of that together is the context. So it's not surprising that we've got some big performance challenges. I want to be really clear, we are not short of data. Our problem is the opposite. We've got too much. What we need here is insight and action. I'm really pleased that David highlighted the cancer problem. That's all red. And actually, I'll come back. We're actually relatively a good performer in many areas, even though they're red here. But cancer's one of the ones where we're not. So I think coming back to this board to have a discussion about what's happening in that space to improve things is really, really important. Of course, we take poor performance seriously, and we take it personally, and I think that's what you'd expect us to be doing. But we shouldn't beat ourselves up. On Friday, we have a meeting. David and I are attending with the exec team. We have a sort of assurance meeting. It's a quarterly thing with the region. And their data shows that actually within the Northwest, we're the quiet achiever. We're doing relatively, generally better than the other two ICB areas. We just don't shout about it as much. Now, we don't want to be complacent in any way. Generally, we're around the national average, and that's not good enough for the people of Lancashire and South Cumbria. So, you know, we don't want to be complacent about it, but you do need that context. I mean, we need to be impatient, we need to be driven to do a hell of a lot better, and we can do that. And I think when you start looking at the variations, you begin to see that actually we can get up there. You know, we've got on not meeting medical criteria to reside, for example, it varies from nearly 25% down to 5%. So there are some significant differences, and we need to sort of use that within our system to level up going forward. But we've got too much data. It's really around insight, and in particular for this board, action. You want to know what we're going to do in those areas where we're underperforming, and we need to be realistic about the pressure the system's under and where we can really make our best bets to get some step change in performance. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. It's a very good end to the discussion. I do think that we, certainly speak for myself, recognise ourselves, Angie, on your challenge. Is this what it's like? There are services under significant pressure, resource pressures and so on and so forth. Kevin and Maggie, you'll feel impatient from the very start of the meeting when Debbie first spoke about where we want to go to and the contributions Jim and other colleagues have made around this. You're right, we are impatient, and we're determined to do the best we can do. We'll recognise all of the issues that you described, but so as a board we want to support you guys to be able to get to where we need to as quickly as possible. That's what we just tell us what that is, and that's what we'll do. We're going to look a bit more at urgent and emergency care.
Thanks, David. So, deep dive into UEC. Again, this is something that I think the framework for deep dives will improve as we do more. And as we develop, as we've said earlier, those sub-board committees further, with the ability to take the deep dives and really look at them through with more than the time that we've got on these agendas, to be able to bring back up to this board the really salient points that we wish to get that collective think on. So at the moment, as execs, we are looking at how we can improve a framework for deep dives so that we're covering the salient points here. I think we're trying as well to do two things, and one is to reflect the eclectic nature of this board. Everybody has got a different level of understanding about what UEC is, and definitions, glossary, all of that. So the paper that's in your pack is more detailed. It is considerably shorter than it was when we first produced it, thanks to the executive colleagues taking a pen to it. And what I am going to do now is just try and focus us on about 5 slides, if I may. So, I'm sorry that's come out quite small. TV screens are only small. So what is working well? What does that pack tell us? Well, as we've already alluded to, I think it's important to recognise the areas where we can already see, as Kevin said, that we're being recognised for some relative good practices, both regionally but nationally as well. So the virtual ward development is a national initiative, and we across Lancs and South Cumbria are ahead of our own trajectory, and we are being contacted by many of the providers by others to see what we're doing, because nationally we're being recognised as doing some good work there. Collaboratively, my own view of what I've seen in the last few weeks is that we are working collaboratively to deliver the 2-hour urgent community response supporting our ambulance activity. We are under such extreme pressure in this area that if we weren't doing some of the work that we are doing, we can only suspect that their performance would be even further compromised than it is. We are looking at what future models may be. Kevin referred to this in his report. There are pockets of some really good practice, and again, we will be going into we will be having a winter summit, either the end of November and early December, depending on the venue and diary commitments of those that we need there. But we will be able to share because we'll have greater time, just exactly how hard and what great innovation seems to be coming out from different parts of our places. I'm not going to read everything out off the screen because my eyesight isn't good enough to actually, my varifocals are failing me. We have got really good relationships developing with our primary care colleagues around, I actually would share with you, I've had more contacts from people in primary care to meet me as part of my induction than anywhere else. So I think that's really great, and everybody wants to be involved in how we do some more of this work. Can't wait to work with them in greater detail. Our key challenges, we've talked about many of them already this morning. We have got real fragmented and inconsistent models across Lancs and South Cumbria for our out-of-hospital work, and that is something we need to urgently address. And I know Kevin will probably want to speak to that as well. I know Kevin's already mentioned several times this morning the real impact that we're having around out-of-hospital care and really how much pressure that's putting us all under. The congestion in our hospitals is feeding nearly everything else, so ambulance handovers not being met. We have some dreadful days. We've got a really good function, a resilience hub, just a few offices away from where I am at Chorley House, and going in there several times in the day. There are times when we have got such intense pressures that, again, our thanks should go to all the people working across those frontline services because it is really tough. We've already talked, we've got an increasing number of patients in our beds who don't meet the criteria to reside. Kevin is absolutely right that that is an area that through winter and throughout the whole of next year we really need to focus as a team. That's probably one of the #1 highly escalated areas for our collective think because it is paralysing many of our indicators. That not meeting the criteria to reside is increasing the bed occupancy across all our hospitals. It impacts on, say, patient safety, and it also has a massive impact on our staff morale. We are seeing an increase in demands for mental health services, particularly assessment and beds. I'm sure Chris will be able to contribute to the debate on that as we get going. We have got significant workforce gaps. That's not new to anybody around this table, and I know James will want to talk about that as well, the work that we're doing. We've also got a very poor physical state of some of our A&Es, and particularly on the Preston site, and then Kevin will be able to speak around the challenges that that's bringing us. The other risk that I'm going to look really quite promptly addressing is an aggregated risk register for us all. It would be great today to have been able to bring you some really scored risks, and again we could have focused on what that was showing us. We just don't have that data yet. We do have non-recurrent funding for essential services and schemes. Kevin and Sam have both alluded to that. We've got poor track record, as I've said in the deep dive, of closing down our escalation winter upon winter upon winter. And as a result of that, I was talking to Kevin earlier this week, it would be really great operationally if we could get some of that capacity closed now, because we would like to open it up again when we see the full force of winter when we get into January. But I think it was probably Chris or someone who said earlier, trying to close that capacity down on top of the acuity issues that we're seeing is pretty slim for us at this stage. But not only does it have an impact on our ability to focus and achieve operationally, it is having a massive impact on our financial performance as well. Can't take away the fact that the acuity of patients is rising. The demands that that's putting on all of our practitioners is really high. Therapeutic time is increasing because of the complexity and because of the workforce gaps. That is really difficult to achieve. And we know nationally, don't we? I'm not saying anything that you're not aware of. All of the literature talks about the patient safety impacts when you've got congestion, and we have got congestion across our system. As we've tried to say in the paper, there's an awful lot going on, particularly focusing on our 111 services and the ability to see for a patient or a community member who rings 111 to be directed to the right clinician much earlier on in their journey, rather than just presenting at an ED department or an urgent treatment centre. There is further focus on that as we go into the winter. The same-day emergency care services, again, not been in the system long enough to talk about this with confidence, but what I am told is we may have been slow off the blocks with that, but we're trying to catch up at pace. And there's some good work going on with that, as there is with some of the frailty work. Again, we may have been slow off the blocks, but we certainly seem to be catching up. We are desperately, I'm told by all of our providers. I spent a day in Morecambe Bay a week ago, and I can honestly say that the focus they had on their patients who were in for longer than 21 days was commendable. It didn't mean they got their patients out, but they were known by name, by location, in a very detailed way. Lots going on in that area. And of course, there is, through the allocation of the winter monies, which we've got another paper for, David, but if I may, I'll just refer to that now. The winter planning round started. There was a circular that came out in mid-August with some returns for the 26th of September about how we were preparing as a system for winter. We now have statutory responsibility and accountability for winter performance. And we've had some good feedback on the returns that we made on the 26th of September. Still work to do. There's a couple of our providers where we need to get alongside and closer to help them with those returns. But there's a lot going on in those schemes to try and increase the collaboration across all of our sectors. Kevin may want to talk later about the submission of a business case for Preston that could see some expansion with their MAU. And there's also a 15-step improvement programme with the Trust and MWAS that we are participating in across the system, again, to really focus on handover delays. We've got increased in the capacity at Finney House, which we may want to come on to. And there's a real commitment, as both Jeff and David have alluded to, that we implement all of the fuller review recommendations. And we are continuing, and we will get closer to the surge plans at place across the system. So just finally, in conclusion, I know you're all fed up hearing my voice. What my observation, which you are all aware of, is we have really normalised in this system and many others working under extreme pressure. We have been in escalation now for probably 2 years plus, and it is very much a fatigue for those who are working at the front line. We know that intensity is going to increase over the winter period. We do need to see more at this board about our approach to flu vaccination and to the rollout of the booster. I think Abdul referred to some of the work that we're doing for the booster. We really need to ask ourselves, are we doing all that we can? And is there anything that we've been blindsided to that we need to push further and faster? And again, when we get into the Winter Summit, we'll be able to tease some of those further implications out as well. Discussion really, David, please.
Thank you. There's an awful lot in there about the challenges, the risks in delivery and the actions that are being taken. It happens every year, winter, and we don't always learn the lessons from previous times, but I think in your presentation, very comprehensive, Maggie, about the actions that we're taking. I note in Appendix A to the paper there's a very clear set of priorities that NHS England have set that I guess you'll be reporting on, and key performance metrics in there. Is your intention that from next month we'll start to use that as a framework for tracking where we're at?
Yes, we will be doing that, and our executive team will see that more on a weekly basis. We've yet to really agree what that reporting mechanism will look like. So what will we be bringing here? And I think after we've had the workshop, after we've had the summit, we'll have developed these KPIs a lot further. We could spend every single board meeting really just on this one subject, but it isn't going to be possible, is it? So again, we'll have to work out how we are, what mechanisms we've got, and where are we having these conversations, which will give us an escalation report up. One of the pieces of work that we're doing as well, again, I've spoken to the NHS Transformation Unit to help us map out where are we having these conversations. I mentioned this when I was here at the last meeting. It was something that I did for Cheshire and Mersey. We worked with the Recovery Support Programme, and we looked in Cheshire and Mersey. There were over 200 meetings a month where flow was being discussed, and actually in Cheshire and Mersey they're really struggling with flow. You know, it beggars the question of, we're in so many meetings, how much time have we got to do the doing? And we can't fall into that bear trap here. So we will look with them to streamline as much as our providers have the appetite to do, and aggregate up a more streamlined reporting mechanism. But yeah, these will be the core indicators that we need to look at, David.
Jeff, please.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just make a brief comment about the data on general practice, and then some discussion about how primary care responds this winter. So the data shows that primary care consultations are increasing, and we've talked about that before, and there's various sources of that data. But the thing it doesn't show is the fact that actually the length of consultations, as face-to-face consultations, have gone up. So telephone consultation typically taking 10 minutes, like the old-fashioned consultation face-to-face was in a lot of practices, but actually face-to-face consultations 15 to 20 minutes, and I don't see any sign of that going backwards to the 10-15 minute average of the past, partly because of the complexity and partly because of the infection prevention control measures, etc., etc. So actually, the volume of work being done is more than what that data shows. That, I just wanted to make that point. I know, and I'm defending my own profession, but it is very true. About this winter, I know there's a lot of work going on with David, fantastic work on Fuller and everything else, but that's probably not enough to actually be ready for next month and the month after, is it? And there's something for me about primary care leadership out with the ICS, not the leadership within the ICS, but the leadership of the as primary care providers about coming together and actually saying we could do this. And I think it comes together in different forms. Primary care leadership. There are primary care networks. There's the LMC. There are the GPs that used to be in CCGs. There's federations and the like. So there's various leadership forms, and they come together in various ways across the different places. But I think there's a need to encourage them to come together at scale in 4 places, and then 4 places come together as one, as a, this is what we could do. I don't think it'll work as I've referenced before in that King's Fund report, if we just impose something. But I think it would work if we talk meaningfully to primary care in the round about what could be done. So that will encompass what can we do differently, what can we stop doing, what do we do more of, because we're not going to see a massive expansion in the workforce. So it's about what are the priorities, and I think it will need, personally, I think it will need a contractual basis to it.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right, Jeff. Thank you. Got Sheena, then Jim.
So I just really wanted to just start by saying a huge thank you to all the people who are working to care for people at the moment. I think they're doing an absolutely magnificent job, and it doesn't matter which part of the sector, which part of health or care people are in. And I just really think I'd like to just express my huge admiration for people. So I really wanted to start with that, really. The second thing I just wanted to go on to was a bit about just thinking, and I know we're talking about winter and the short-term stuff, but just to return to this bit about the medium-term kind of look, which has to be a thread through what we do. I really just wanted us to consider as we go forward the role of place in thinking about taking a population-based response, the theme that we've already talked about today about that meeting need in a very different way to the way that we do at the moment, and just really sort of just picking that up through a theme we might want to just perhaps go back to as a board to understand where's place in all of this, because that's clear, as we all have said already today, that kind of focus on that population, the integration bit, but how do we bring everybody together around meeting need very differently, absolutely getting into the prevention agenda, and just thinking about that, also about the integration of physical and mental health needs. And we've talked, haven't we, about developing community services and the need to make sure that everything we do brings that together, particularly thinking about the work that David talked about in terms of the community mental health transformation work and taking that right back into communities where people live their lives. So I think it's the short and the medium and the longer term stuff, but absolutely get the bit about all the work that's going on, and clearly there's a lot of work going on to think about how do we respond effectively this winter to meeting people's needs differently. And that bit about that Kevin said is that real focus about saying how do we help people stay as well as they can within their own homes, and if they need to go into hospital they get back there quickly. So thank you.
Thank you. And from your experience, Sheena, gone through the summary of the actions, anything missing?
For me, I think there is the bit about just actually making sure that we look at people's mental health needs in partnership. So the sense that people really need that support. There was a mention around people coming in to emergency departments with that increased mental health need, and I think if we can see people and actually see people in that holistic way and make sure we support as far as we can Chris's teams in the early intervention teams and also the liaison work, I think will be really positive. That's not only people in emergency departments but also people in hospital beds as well. So I think that's a key area that we need to make sure we've got that effectively being done.
Thank you. Very helpful, Jim.
Thanks. First of all, I've got great sympathy for Maggie trying to oversee this. It's an enormous area, and you're absolutely right. We could spend the whole meeting just talking about this. So we have to home in on things. One of the things I would like to see, if possible, is some sort of quantification of the impact of what's going on. We've got a long list of, you had a list of the developments that are happening and then the action that's underway. There's no, I don't take too much assurance from that because there's no attempt to estimate the impact that's going to have on the system. So we're in a pretty poor position at the moment, not as bad as other places, thankfully. But to what extent is that going to improve it? Is that going to just absorb what we think is the coming rise in numbers of attendance or whatever? We just need to have some sort of something which can give us greater assurance than just a list of projects that are underway. So it's, without getting into too much detail, somehow telling us we've invested this amount of money, it's going to have this impact, and then we may just feel more comfortable with the position we're in.
Yeah, we can develop this, I think, over the next period. Do you want to say anything?
Can I just come back on a couple of those points? Absolutely. I think it is absolutely. I need to say this in a very plain way, because if I try and dress it up, it'll come out all wrong. I recognise the scale of opportunity that we've got together as a new ICB. Wouldn't have come and taken this job if I wasn't really optimistic about what we can do together in the future, particularly at place level. I am slightly frustrated that I've joined you in September and not, last September, because we're in winter now already, as we've been talking about, and we are not in a position where we are aggregated up in any way. And I've met some amazing people in the month who have been really in the detail of their particular scheme. But when you ask them, how does that impact? They're not used to talking in that way. So they can't articulate what they think will be the impacts month by month, week by week. We don't seem to have that kind of PMO discipline where we're thinking about what are we trying to achieve and how do we work back? How will we demonstrate that week by week? Now, that doesn't mean they aren't great people who can't learn that and get on board really quickly, but it's a piece of work we need to do. We, as Kevin alluded to earlier, had some away time as execs this week, and we talked about what we need to do tactically to get now to the end of winter, and also how do we also still as an exec team work strategically, because we have got some gaps this winter. Talking to Kevin already around how we as an ICB can work alongside the PCB. I didn't get a chance to talk to Tracy and Angie, and I know a member of my team did. But really, I think, Tracy, some of your comments particularly were frustrated that we are going into a winter when we've still not really done anything different to what we've done previously. But we're going to have to get through this winter in as best way that we possibly can, and we've got some good people working in this space. At the same time, we need to be concentrating on what we do next year to give us a better strategic position as we go into winter 24-25. So I absolutely agree with all of the comments that have been made, and I know that Sheena's thanks to people won't go unmissed either.
Thank you. We've got Chris, then David.
Thank you, Chair. Maggie, I suppose it's just to see the physical health and the mental health urgent care pathway together. So a lot of the deep dive rightly focuses on that, not meeting criteria to reside within acute. But if I look within our mental health beds today, there would be circa 80 patients. And then I look at the numbers of patients in A&Es and 136 suites and the community. And then the offshoot of that is not necessarily those ambulance turnaround waits, but the placements in out of area that come at a significant cost to the system, but also on that patient experience of moving people away at crisis from their local. So I think it'd be really good to work with you around bringing that view into the urgent care pathway.
If I may, David, I think isn't it a great example though of how we've just picked up and moved into old world into this, and if we're not careful, because winter will be so busy for many of us, we'll just roll on into something that we don't want to be. So I think the test for us will be getting through winter with some good data that indicates how we've done, particularly against the investment that we're going to make. But particularly, how do we start talking about the holistic needs of our community, both, as Sheena said, through place, but also through the very diverse needs of the population as well. So, yeah, I welcome the opportunity. Can't wait.
And David?
And finally, so Maggie, well, just to share with the board in some respects, we had a 2-day away day for the exec team, and what we did discuss with this matrix working that we all need to have together, because we need, so only by working together can we actually tackle some of the really knotty issues. So just to share with you that while we've been thinking about flow in secondary care, we've also been thinking about flow in primary care. And Jeff's highlighted the fact that from the data we have, the number of patients who have multi-morbidity issues, they're complex appointments, that number has doubled over the last 2 years. We've got to do something different. And so just to share with you, Maggie, that we are developing a primary care winter plan as well. And I think we just need to work with you and share that with you and perhaps bring that to the workshop as well, because I think we need to think of the whole system. Thank you.
Yeah, and our expectation will be that it will all be part of a single plan, David. Yeah, as long as that's the way it's being built. I'm a bit surprised that we've got a double stream on that. Kevin, do you want to, I'll come back to you to summarise.
Yeah, I hope it's clear it's going to be really tough this winter, we'll do everything we can, but it's really important as we sort of go back to the beginning of the meeting that we are positive and we keep the faith. As a board, my guidance to you would be look to the short term and look to the medium term. On the short term, this winter, at our level of systems, Maggie and her team are coordinating this with the leaders in the trusts, obviously. The questions I would be asking as a board are we well organised? Have we got a grip with recognising the immense pressure the system is under? In the medium term, this is the most important thing for you as a board. Just to give you some of the numbers, 460 or so beds not meeting medical criteria to reside. By next winter, 758, I think it is, virtual ward beds. Finney House, I think, is 98 over the 2 winters. That's a huge increase in capacity of our system, and we're doing well on those initiatives. We need to keep all of that going and do more. So if we can get all of our physical community health services operating as well as East Lancashire across the whole patch, that makes a big material difference. If we can add to the Finney House and the investments in dom care around around intermediate care and domiciliary care, as we discussed earlier, that will make a huge difference going forward. And of course, we've got to strengthen the primary care system, as Jeff so eloquently said. For me, what we need to do, though, is this is where place can play a big role going forward. Place has got to be the sort of conductor of the orchestra for a lot of this for the future, because it doesn't happen in one of these reports. It happens in a place, doesn't it? And it's that joining it up. But we've got to get it right across the region, and we've got to get it right in our 4 places going forward. So if we have that dual approach of keeping an eye on this winter and making sure we've got grip, but not lose sight of those strategic changes and have it well joined up in places, that's how we'll be successful. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good summary, Kevin. I'm conscious that we're already over time, but we do need to look at the emergency preparedness, resilience response policy. I can't defer that.
Thanks, David. And again, I'll try and be really brief on this. The statutory responsibility that we had in CCGs has passed over to us now as an ICB. So we are designated as a category 1 responder under the Civil Contingencies Act. And this paper really outlines how we will manage that responsibility. As we speak, I am EPRR for our organisation, along with a very nice member of staff who has already joined us at Band 6. So between the 2 of us, there's a numerous amount of workshops. Some David has already attended, and some that I will start to take over from. We have got an EPRR lead joining us as we go into November, and we will look to, before the end of the calendar year, have gone into workshop mode so that we can really understand what our responsibilities are, timeframes, etc. And also, we did talk, the member of staff that's joining us is a very experienced EPRR lead. It'd be great to have her on board. We did talk about trying to put, for the deep dive into UEC, discuss what happens when it tips over from being normal winter into something that's a major incident in relation to the Civil Contingencies Act. But on my own, it was impossible to do for today. But we do need to, in a workshop mode, before the end of the year, come together to all of us understand what our designated responsibilities are. So those who are familiar with EPRR papers, I'm sure will see, and business continuity will see, that this is a very standard framework that we have, that we've worked to. Unless there's any questions, I just ask us to adopt it at this stage.
Jim.
Thanks. No questions on the policy. Very happy with the policy. It's the extent to which we could cope if we've had a major incident tomorrow.
So can I pick that up? So we have a position where we have been on call since the 1st of July. We have 2 tiers. We have a tactical person who's on call, who's typically a band 8D or a 9, and then we have one of the members of the executive team who's the strategic commander. Everyone's undergone training, and there's been further training that's been arranged by the North region, which we've been through as well, which was mandatory. So, you know, recognising there are some people who are still relatively new to it. I mean, I've been on call at this level for 9 years now. But nevertheless, everybody's been through training, everybody's supported. The feedback we've got so far is working very well. And we'll just have to see as we go into winter in particular, when we expect more challenges and, of course, more flooding, how we get on. Okay.
Thanks, David. Jeff?
Just a very quick plea around primary care and business continuity. The one thing that would really help, and we nearly did this in Barrow in fairness, and then the GPs didn't do it, and would have helped them enormously in the pandemic, is to have a shared database where all the databases of the different practices. It doesn't have to happen across the whole of Lancashire, just in localities. So it means if one practice goes down, and we had one where it caught fire, they can go to another practice and access their own patients' records, or other doctors can when they were sharing care during the pandemic. It's a very simple, easy thing to do. So it's a plea possibly to the new digital lead. I think it's a simple thing to do, and it would be amazingly positive.
Thank you. Okay, we approve the policy. CCG account, Sam.
Thank you, Chair. So this is quite brief, but this report provides the board with an overview of the process really and the links to the 8 former CCG accounts for the year 21-22. So if it was a normal organisation going forward, we would normally have seen an AGM for each of these organisations. So what the ask is really, as there's no AGM, there's still a requirement to publish online by the end of September. So all of those annual reports are on our website, so they've been put on our website. And the CCGs obviously cease to exist then after the first 3 months of the current year. So there's a link to all 8 reports in the paper, and they've been produced in the same structure as they've taken through the respective governing bodies. So they went through each of the governing bodies, they've been reviewed, they've been assessed in each CCG and gone through the right audit profiles. So there were no material changes in the audit process to the accounts, and each CCG had a true and fair view of its accounts, so that was fine. There was an ask, though, that some of the unadjusted items that were held in CCG accounts that had been carried forward got adjusted for. So as an allowable deficit, NHSEI asked them to put that through as an adjustment, which was like a technical deficit at the end of the year. And that's reflected in the accounts as you'll read them through. But it still gave a true and fair view of the accounts. So it's just for this board to receive them. They're all there online. Happy to take any questions. I think the one point I would like to make, just I suppose it's been a bit of a theme for this board, but there's a huge amount of work that went on from all the CCG staff in the finance teams to produce those accounts, and then they had to do another set after the first 3 months without really knowing where their roles were in the future. So it was a huge ask of those people. So I'd just like to, you know, on behalf of the board, really say a big thank you, because it was a lot of work for those teams.
Thank you very much. Endorsed. Formally received those accounts. Thank you.
Thank you.
Committee business, if I could just ask the committee chairs highlight any issues that they want the board to be aware of at this stage. I'm very pleased that I've spoken to each of the chairs, that we've got the committees up and running now. I'll take them in a different order than listed on the paper, just to keep everybody on the toes. Debbie first.
Thanks, David. So we've had the second of our workshops for the Public Engagement and Involvement Assurance Committee. Great meeting, great representation from partners who will be sitting in the first formal committee meeting, which actually happens next week. So we spend time really focusing on what the operating model would be. So what's the strategy for working with people, communities and carers. And how that will translate through into place, or sort of the various parts of the system to be able to support a joined up approach. We had a fantastic new hospitals programme deep dive, so we did a bit of a test around what a deep dive would look like, what we'd want to receive, how we'd want to work as an assurance committee on behalf of board. So that's given us a really brilliant framework that we're looking to roll out at future meetings. And then another couple of reports that I'm looking forward to sharing with board when they're developed is one's an assurance report around everything that we're doing that's public patient facing, around assurance and involvement and what impact it's having and what difference it's making and how it fits back with national expectations and also the board's ambitions about how we work with people to develop our approach moving forward. And an insight report, so looking at all the information and things that patient public carers are telling us and trying to draw that together to support decision making across the board and across the various structures that we've got. So I look forward to giving that update in the 3A's format at the next board meeting.
Excellent, thanks. Debbie, Ibby, please.
Yeah, thanks, David. Very good start to the People Board. Some great work that was done prior to it to really pull together some powerful data. So we've got a real comparative perspective on where the variations are around a number of people metrics for our providers. We noted that we need to do a bit more work in terms of getting that similar data for social care and also a bit more work around primary and community care. So we've got that fully integrated perspective on what's happening with the workforce. The other bit, James has already mentioned, I think what was helpful from that perspective is helping the board to really understand where individual organisations probably needs a bit more work, but also where there are kind of emerging themes, I think, where as an ICB we can add a bit more value and a bit more capacity. We've picked up the issue about mental health in particular in the workforce and the number of our staff who are off because of mental health issues. It seems sometimes our focus tends to be significantly on physical health and musculoskeletal issues, but clearly we need to really focus in on what we are doing around mental health. The RES and the DEST data was really interesting, again, interesting variations, but also very interesting in terms of looking at the action plans around the RES and DES, and for very similar issues, very different actions in different provider organisations. So that's something we need to understand a bit better in terms of what is best practice that perhaps we can share across the piece. And just one thing for us to note as an ICB, our own staff profile is quite different to what the RES data in particular tells us of our staff profile in our provider organisations. We don't have anywhere near as much diversity as the system does, so that's something I think we need to keep an eye on as we go forward. That's all from me, David, thank you.
Thank you, Ibby. That's great. Sheena, please.
Yeah, thanks. So we had our first formal meeting of the committee. We had one set-up meeting and very pleased that we've got our first formal meeting in there. We deliberately started with a patient story because I think it's really important to focus on that as we did in the beginning of board today here. And the patient story took was really getting us to think from a quality committee point of view what we need to do to really change the way that we think about quality, is thinking about it from a population perspective and actually understanding how our population experiences safe, effective services with good experience. So we heard from one of our third sector organisations who looks after particularly people with very vulnerable needs and heard about experiences of those people accessing health services. So it gave us great insight to that, and particularly the need to focus on how do we be even more connected in what we do across health and social care, and to ensure that that people who access services and people who support them are aware of how those connections work. So I think that was a really good starting point for us as our first formal committee meeting. We clearly are looking very closely at making sure we've got the right things in place in terms of our statutory responsibilities of the board in relation to our continuing healthcare and safeguarding, and we're making sure that we understand that we set up things like the new patient safety framework, etc. So there's some really good start to our work. We did, however, agree, and we have that planned for next week, that we've got a development session because we want to make sure that as a committee we are as effective as possible and that we can work effectively together and are actually addressing the right things. So we have got a work programme, but we will be revisiting that through our development session to make sure not only the what we do, but just as importantly how we do it as a quality committee and how we do that with all of our partners in health and social care across Lancs and South Cumbria. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sheena. And David, please.
Just the one thing to report is just unravelling the discussions relating to delegation processes. You'll probably be aware that as the ICB, we currently commission general practice services, but it's anticipated from April of next year that will include pharmacy, dental and optometry services as well. So there was a form that we had to complete for the region, a very detailed form that was sent in after Kevin's signature. Probably around about 4 weeks ago. We await their response, but we are eagerly looking forward to that. And we're currently working very closely with the some members of the regional team who are supporting our primary care commissioning function, and we anticipate they will also move to be part of the ICB from April as well. Thank you.
Well done, David. And Jim.
Yeah, thanks. It was our second audit committee. And I think if you read the notes, work is underway now. Internal auditors have started doing jobs, external auditors starting to do their work programme. We spent quite a bit of time looking at the CCG accounts and financial sustainability for the new organisation, so there was quite a bit went on. We can't at this point give any real substance to the assurances we can offer to the board, but that will come in time. We probably are where you'd expect the audit committee to be at this point in time, in truth. The one comment I would make is that there's a reference to the fact that the committee acknowledged the plan to establish a finance committee by the end of this financial year. However, given the financial and performance pressures, it was suggested that it should be done as soon as possible. And today's meeting has reiterated the importance of that point.
Yeah, absolutely has. Thank you to all the committee chairs and all the committee members. We're up and running, and I think there's a huge amount of heavy lifting that's going to take place in all of the committees, and we'll work with you as chairs to work out how we get the right flow of the right things from the committee work into this board and the commission's back. With regard to your last, so we'll formally receive the minutes of the audit committee. With regard to the last point, Kevin, I think we can get cracking now with the finance committee. I'll ask Roy to take the chair of the Finance and Performance Committee, and I'll look for you to think about how we get that up and running as quickly as possible.
Yep.
Thank you all. I've not been notified of any items of any other business for today's meeting. We've had some very good discussions. I apologise for overrunning time, but I think everything that's been included in the meeting has been highly relevant and highly important to us, and I thank everybody for their attendance and contributions, and we meet again in a few weeks on the 2nd of November. There's a question about the venue for the 2nd. I still think that's open, is that right? And we'll confirm venue as soon as possible. Thank you all very much.